Okay, good evening. My name is Susan Stevenson. I'm the chair of the Board of Architectural Review and Historic Preservation, and I'm calling the meeting of February 25th, 2019 to order. Do I have a motion to open the meeting?
I make a motion that we open this meeting of the Board of Architecture Review and Historic Preservation on February 25th, 2019.
Second. Aye.
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 Aye. Great. Before we get started, I would just like to introduce historic consultant Zach Studenroth, our videographer Charles Styler, our attorney Wayne Bruin, the board to my right, Jeff Broadlead, Curtis Highsmith to my left, Christina Redding and Rob Coburn. Jolie Sanchez is the recording secretary. If anyone has materials to present, please put them on this table in front of us, facing us, so the videographer can pick up the graphics. And I'd like to make it clear that I expect everyone, the board, the public, anyone here, to act with civility and speak with civility. That being said, let's go ahead with approval of the minutes.
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes of January 14th and January 28th.
Second.
Aye.
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 There were some corrections for February 11th, and Antoinette is away, so we're going to have to hold off on those until the next meeting, if you don't mind. Great. Next, written decisions.
Signs. We do have one sign.
No, we
Oh,
have
we-
one sign.
Oh, sorry, I skipped Hidden Gem. What a mistake. 47A Jobs Lane, a storefront sign.
Hi, my name is Ron Fisher. I'm here for the applicant.
Good evening.
Sorry.
Yeah, I saw it.
Do you have a picture of the sign by any chance?
I have a copy.
Could you put it on the table?
Facing
Thank you.
us? Thank you very much.
I mean, I can maybe sign this.
It'll come up on the screen if you need to.
Oh, it's in the courtyard, right?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, it's pretty clear. It's just a black text on a white PVC board. It's shaped like an oval, and it's going to go above the door.
Your name for the record?
Ronald Fisher for Fisher Signs and Shirt.
And the material is
3/4 inch thick PVC, which is like an AZAC.
board members?
No objection.
Public? Anyone in the public have anything to say about this sign?
I'll make a motion that we approve the sign for Hidden Gem on Job's Lane.
Second.
Aye.
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 Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Next, written decisions. First, Anthony Punnett, 310 Hill Street.
Do you have the new original, Susan?
We made it an original, yes.
We have the original.
I do.
Oh, you do?
Well, we've marked it as such. It's been amended. Any comments? Are you ready to vote on this?
This is the approval of the chimney with the brick veneer.
Yes.
I'll make a motion that we approve the written decision for Anthony Punnett at 310 Hill Street.
Second.
Aye.
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 Great, motion carries. I have the original, which I will return to you with a copy,
Okay.
marked copy. Would you like that? Here we go. Thank you, Rob. Next, 131 Main Street, LLC.
We have the
Motion,
original.
yes. Okay, motion, do we have any comments, or we're good to go?
No?
I'll make a motion that we approve the written decision for 131 Main Street LLC.
Second.
Aye.
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 The ayes have it. Sorry. Next, John and Erica Grossman, 42 Post Crossing.
Is there an original? Do you have
I think
an
she
original?
has the
You have all the originals, Susan?
I have the original. Motion, a motion to approve.
I make a motion that we approve the written decision by council for Shannon and Grossman at 42 Post Crossing.
On vote?
A second. Oh, go ahead, Curtis.
Second.
Aye.
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 Carries. Great. Thank you. That ends our written decisions for this evening, and we're moving on. There are no driveway gates, historic or non-historic, this evening, which I find miraculous myself. We're moving on to public hearings, non-historic. Michael and Annie Falk, 12 Squabble Lane, construct two-story addition to existing dwelling.
I'm sorry?
We moved to historic.
Oh, he left his sign thing. It's all right, he's covering it up. Thank you. Ixnay.
Do you have affidavits for us?
I do.
Very small sets. Take out all the papers and put them up.
Small sets.
Hi, your name, sir?
Good evening. Marco Domingos for David Scott Park Architects, representing the owners. Okay. Just walk through the project. This is an addition to an existing residence.
Are those small sets?
You have small plans for us?
That would be helpful, otherwise we're going to get all these enormous papers out. Thank you. She has to stamp. Everything has to go to your right, sir.
Yes.
I'll keep one for you.
There's even more.
That's great.
Okay.
What would you mean?
Okay.
Go ahead.
So it's an existing residence that we are adding a cabana, a gym, and a garage with an office above. Just look through the second page, it's easy to see. This is the existing garage that we are demoing, and we will also be demoing the existing swimming pool, which is here. And the proposed addition, which is highlighted here, also has a terrace and a swimming pool that we're putting back. So, in terms of architecture, we're keeping exactly the same details that the existing house has, which is stucco, cedar roof shingles, and mahogany windows. As you could see here, to this side is the existing residence. This is the addition we are proposing. which consists of a gallery space that you walk through, a cabana for the pool, a gym, and then, like I said earlier, a second floor office above the gym. And also the terrace that encompasses outside those three areas. Go to the plan here. Some general site photos of the entrance driveway, neighbors to the southeast. This is the rear view of the existing house now. Another existing view of the courtyard, of the motor courtyard. Some of the details that I spoke about earlier, which is the stucco detailing, the wood, shingles, the windows, again here. All the details stay consistent with the existing house. In terms of a layout,
On these, is this existing and proposed?
yes, so,
Top is, no,
no, this is all proposed.
this is all proposed.
Renderings are all proposed.
The renderings are all proposed, but it's easy to identify what's new and what's existing.
Existing house.
So in this first image of the entry courtyard, the existing house is here. This is the garage addition.
So this is the addition.
It's enormous. Huge, isn't it? Is there, on this, the second floor, the
Yes.
structure, what's on top of that?
It's a roof terrace there.
A roof terrace?
Is there a roof plan for that?
Yes, there is. So if in this, I'll show you in this rendering here, you could actually see it a little more clear. The aerial view, the last, you can see
Yeah.
behind the roof, there is a terrace that is there, and I'll show you the roof plan. So you can, so this is the second floor office here, right? And there's an interior stair that, with the skylight access up to the attic roof terrace.
But there's not a roof plan that shows the roof and the deck.
I do not have a roof plan that shows the roof and the deck. Unfortunately, I thought I did, but I do not.
How high the sidewalls of the terrace deck, how high do they come up?
I'm sorry?
On the terrace deck, or the widow's walk, how high are the sidewalls?
36. Yes, 36 inches above the deck.
What's the maximum height of the structure? Is that next question?
Maximum structure height.
It looks like 23.
23.7.
23.7 for the addition? The two-story addition?
Yeah, the
Yes.
top of the deck wall.
The top of the deck wall.
It's actually lower than the main house.
I'm sorry?
The highest peak of the addition is lower than the main house.
Highest peak. Oh, I see. Yeah,
Which
you're
is
right, on
true.
this.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
So overall, the entire addition is stepped down
Correct.
than the original structure.
That's correct.
Where that widow's walk or roof deck is present, what is the most was the closest distance between the resident or the neighbor's property? How far from the property line?
From the top of the deck?
Is this the
48 feet.
So your
To the
line
line
is
that's to the edge of the roof, so we've got another 4 feet in, so about 51 feet.
51 feet away from the point of impact where a person can look. So your line of sight is 40 or 50 feet from where you are at the peak, which is the third floor, into the neighbor's backyard. What type of screening is going to help impact any privacy issues?
There's an existing hedge. Here on the plan. There's an existing tall hedge that lines the entire
What is the
property.
height of the hedge?
I'm sorry?
Height of the hedge?
I don't know the exact type. It's got to be 12 to 15 feet.
Yeah,
It's pretty tall.
I looked at the property today, it's 12 feet.
Yeah.
Yes.
Top of that form, there's a note that says the pipe railing on the top of that deck is going to match existing. This is on A2.
Yes.
Where is the existing pipe railing on the
I'll
house?
show you here in the rendering, but it's here.
Well, that's a railing, that's not a pipe railing. It says pipe rail and stanchions. Oh, it says finished to match existing house rails. So
Yes.
is that, what color is that then?
Black. Yeah.
Have any enormous number of parking spaces too? How many bedrooms? Are you adding bedrooms? You're adding bathrooms for sure, right?
Yes.
But no bedrooms, or so you say?
Well, I think the office is considered a bedroom.
Oh, that's very honest of you. Yes, thank you.
We've sized the septic system accordingly to make sure that that would not be an issue.
Right, okay. This is a substantial increase. I'm uneasy in looking at it, but I can't explain why, but maybe I was when I saw it the first time. Maybe it's fine, I don't know. We gotta think about it. Other board members?
I looked at the property today, and while it's a substantial addition, it's not incompatible with
Right.
what's essentially an eclectic neighborhood of different styles, from contemporary to traditional, from relatively large-scale houses. There's a good amount of spacing between and among the houses that, while the deck in other neighborhoods would present a problem, in this particular neighborhood, I'm less concerned about it, unless any of the other board members have issues. But beyond that, I have no objections.
The additions you made were stepped down. They were spread in a manner I think were respectful to neighbors. You didn't look at vertical construction, look at expanding it, and have a consistent flow. You created a beautiful courtyard. I think it would be an amazing look views from every one of those, whether it be the gym or
Yes.
the. I just think you did a great job. I don't have any issues. Good luck with it.
Christina?
Question is on the roof lines. When you look at the west elevation, the back of the house, you see a number of different roof lines with different pitches and different heights. I guess the ones that stick out to me are the sort of truncated roof over the office. Makes it look a little mansard-esque. And then the cabana roof line just has a shallower angle than all of them. Is that to make it look more like a separate structure in a way, or
Yes.
like a pool house cabana?
Yes.
I just wish it didn't have quite so many angles. I'm also bothered by what I guess is sort of the northernmost element of the existing house, just has a different roof angle to what?
It's very, very eclectic. The roof is the existing roof is, there's quite a few pitches that are different, so this, it's not unlike what's existing.
I don't have it.
So, are we good on this? I'm uneasy, but I don't have a specific objection. I think it is very busy in terms of what you're confronted with, but,
And check with the comments of the floor.
well, I'm still talking.
I think I take to heart what Jeff said, which is, and it's not an excuse.
Right,
It's a nice neighborhood.
you're right.
There are large and sprawling houses
And
in
there
there.
are all kinds of things in there. I agree with that. Is there any,
They were going to start from the very beginning and do something new. This is not the best they can do.
okay. Anyone from the public who'd like to speak on this application at 12 Squabble Lane? No? That being said, are we ready to vote on this? Okay, motion?
I'll make a motion that we approve the application for Michael and Annie Falk at 12 Squabble Lane.
Second.
Second,
Aye.
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 Approved. Good luck, sir.
Good evening.
Do you want some of these back, because we don't need all of them?
Yeah, the next,
Stamp one we should keep.
yeah, and another, well, are the big plans? The big plans are here.
And this stamp, I checked.
They're stamped, so we don't actually need the little plans, do we? Let's put one. Okay. Because the big plans are what I signed. Moving on, public hearings historic. Number 1, Carol Welsh, 340 Hill Street has been adjourned, we agreed, till March 25th. Is that right? That leaves SH 24 LLC, 24 Gin Lane. This application is closed, subject to written comments and written decisions, of which there were many written comments in my visit to the building department today. Board members, do you have any,
Were there many written comments?
well, there were lots of pieces of paper in there,
2 pieces.
3 that I saw. I have them. Has,
There were
there was,
petitions, when I say petitions, by the applicant and the objectants. And I read the applicant's submission, and while I disagree with the application of the logic and the conflating of proportion and scale, I nonetheless have no objections to this particular project, at this particular application only.
24.
24.
That's what we're talking about. Rob, do you have any comments, or did you have time, or do you want more time?
No, I had looked at it all.
You have?
I made time, yeah.
And is there a vast eerie silence? You have nothing to say? I'm sorry. I missed it.
Do I have anything to say?
After having read all the commentary, all the submissions,
At this point, I don't, no.
so we would be, so are you ready to close this? Or do you want another week to think about this, another 2 weeks?
I'm ready.
Curtis?
Application's already closed. At this point is the
For us, yeah.
determination of instructing our council to prepare a written decision for final approval.
Right.
I have nothing further to add to the
I'm just
application.
letting the board discuss the application.
Oh, I read everything that came in, and I don't need any more information.
I have, since this is a relatively small dwelling, I have no real misgivings. I think there was an argument about the siting of this house, which I thought was prescient. It was something that I had failed to consider in the past, and that I think, looking at the properties surrounding, including Mr. Ayers' house, which I think is situated, which is large, and is a new house, which is in a similar situation to these, to 24 and 28, that there is nothing there. We're adding something in the historic district. That Mr. Ayers' house addresses Gin Lane in a way, because of the curve, that makes it look less imposing and is fairly compact, although it's a large house of 10,000 plus feet. And I think it's a very positive way of having dealt with the situation. The 24 Gin Lane house, if it had been situated to also face Gin Lane, I think would have been a better way to do it, but I don't think it's such a bad situation that I would vote against it, really. So I think we are ready to close this, to ask council to prepare.
Can I just mention with respect to that I did go back to the neighborhood, and I also looked at satellite photographs, and there are actually several houses in the vicinity that are not orthogonal to the street. Most of those that are not orthogonal to the street are orthogonal to either their side lot lines, or they sort of split the difference. If they're on the ocean, they sort of split the difference between the street, the angle of the street and the angle of the ocean. But there are...
Is that right? Because spreading this out, I feel that fairly, maybe down to Meadow Beach is pretty much, and Mr. Ayers and Wilden Manor are the area that I'm looking at, not the huge beach, historic beach area, because there's a lot of variation. I also feel that faulting Fairleigh for being historic is unfortunate in every way. That was there first.
But I'm not
No one
faulting
was
it.
making rules about anything. There was nothing else against it. The Betts put their houses, I think, in a fairly straightforward way on the land. And what we're talking about is an empty lot, of which there are many ways to put a building on that. We don't have that with historic properties. And I'd also like to say that in some of the discussion last time, someone said that they were making, Mr. Schleifer said, making something historic. You can't make something historic. It exists as part of history, and the job of the ARB, at least one of the jobs, is to maintain the history of the historic beach community. So whatever was put there before 1900, let's say, is extant. There's no complaining about how it was put on. It was put on because there wasn't much around, or for whatever reason, like Thomas Guyard wanted to have those houses closer together. And I personally believe that Fairleigh is sort of one of the most important parts of that community, of that little part of our historic village. So I don't want, I think that that's important to realize, that we can't fault the placement of buildings that were put in at the end of the 19th century. It doesn't make sense.
I'm not faulting Fairleigh, and I don't cite any of the Fairleigh houses, but from my review, 44, 46, 48, 56, and 376 Gin Lane are all noticeably oblique to the street, some by as much as 30 to 45 degrees. There are 6 of the first 8 houses on South Main Street going north from Gin Lane are not square to the street.
Well, their appearances.
That's my point, is that we don't notice it,
Well, but that...
number one. And number two, it
That's
does
important.
exist.
But this house is skewed to completely to eastward facing, no?
But this house is set back as
It
far
is
further than
set back.
most of them.
I agree.
From the street. So I just,
Okay.
I wanted to clarify, I think there was a comment made that there's only one other house that's not orthogonal. I don't believe that's true.
Well,
And I don't believe we
I
see them.
spent a lot of time walking and looking at these properties, and that's why I thought Mr. Ayers' house was so interesting, because it dealt with facing the street in a way that I thought was
I agree.
really smart.
It's on a gentle curve and then
No,
an abrupt
he
curve.
took advantage of the curve, though, in a way that was smart.
Yeah, I agree.
Because it's big and it's pretty boxy, but you never think that because you're either on one side or the other. And it's pretty high up, so you can't avoid seeing it. It was done in a very clever fashion, and I thought that was a good way of dealing with a new house in this particular area. That being said, shall we ask?
The only one, can I just ask for one clarification? And I see Mr. Goldblum here. You submitted
allowed to do that?
materials on
Yes, go ahead.
written materials. I saw written materials substantively on 28 Gin Lane, but I didn't see any written materials substantively on 24 Gin Lane. Is that intentional? Is something omitted? He's going to have to
You
come
have
to
to
the,
come
sorry
up.
about that, but I just want to make sure we're not missing
I
materials.
think there
I'm told I made a typo, because there was a shorter document that dealt with 24. It was, I think, a couple of pages.
I probably haven't.
It did not have any, it only, yeah, I think it had the three plates that were associated with it, very, very brief.
Well, that's a problem.
And that arrived
No, it's
at-
not. It's in there. We respond, John Bennett, the applicant. It's in there. We responded to it. It was an obvious typo.
Well,
yeah.
but there was some difficulty with the documents.
No, there wasn't. No, there wasn't. It was in there. We responded to it.
Mr. Bennett, I'm speaking. There may have been some difficulty with the documents today in the building department, which
Well, I was in all last week.
I know, doesn't mean anything. It's where they put it. This is 2428. Mr. Gold. 28.
Excuse me, I can, we dug up an extra copy, so if you want.
Well,
I'm sorry, I don't have more.
I see this, but it,
That's it.
February 25th.
January 31 is the date on this.
This has February 4th and was stamped into the department on February 25th.
I can't speak to the sequencing. This may be an earlier copy that the attorney had in his folder. Oh, you got the right one?
That's subsequent to the Thursday date, but I'll waive any
Yeah,
problem.
I mean, it was, I think there might have been,
see, that's, I think,
you know what, let me hold off on that one, because he has the one that's, I think, parallel to that one. I may have, found another typo and corrected it. Yeah.
okay, I do have, is this it?
February 4. It's one
18.
page. It's
I have
one
a-
page plus some,
Oh, no, I don't have that.
one page plus some illustrations. God knows why these came out.
20 minutes to close out.
Let's just use
This
this.
is dated February 4th. It should have been in the file before then.
I think so, because these did not come out correctly, so,
Please.
yeah. Right. That's right. I don't know what it's attached to. The other ones. Where's the one page? That was it.
So now, help Wayne, what do we do?
If I may,
Yes,
if you let me
please.
have the document and I can show it to Mr. Bennett, and if he's familiar with the document and you've had the opportunity to respond, the question is the board want to accept it into the record at this point?
Didn't Mr. Bennett already waive and said he's okay?
The problem is,
That's
have we
what I'm
read
trying to
it?
get
I
to
mean,
the
is it
bottom.
part of the file? I have all kinds of things
I
here.
think there was a facsimile of that in the file that I saw.
Today?
Yeah.
Yeah,
May
this
have been
is,
today.
this is filed after the required date, but I waive any problem with it. You should just consider it as part of the record. I have no problem.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
There seem to be some things that were put in different places because they came in later, Mr. Bennett. I don't know what to do about it.
The objectants on submitted stuff subsequent to the date when they were supposed to, And my understanding is they were put in a different file because they were contrary to the directive of the board, but I have no problem with waiving any infirmity of those as a result of the date of their submission. I don't think there's anything in there that changes anything, so thank you.
Okay, put this in the file. Now the question is, do we have,
Oh, my God.
Why don't we move to written decision?
what?
Question
I
is,
think we move to written decision
Yes.
if everything's been submitted.
Do I, okay,
motion you need, just you direct us to prepare a decision for you.
but you're not Expo, right? Council.
Review the tape, yes,
Yes.
council,
Council, we're moving to,
please.
is everyone prepared to
I'll assist
end
both.
the discussion of this? Until, we are allowed to discuss when the written decision is presented, isn't that correct,
Absolutely.
Mr. Braun?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we'll close this for written decision. 24, SH24 LLC, 24 Gin Lane, closed for written decision.
Second.
Already was closed.
Yeah. For written decision.
Right.
It was closed,
Further clarification, it was already closed for decision.
it was closed to written comments and written decision. Oh, you're right.
Right.
Okay, sorry. I thought it was, aye. Next.
Aye.
No, we don't have to do it, it's done.
Sorry.
All right, moving ahead. SH28 LLC, 28 Gin Lane. Construct two-story single-family dwelling with attached garage and accessory pool house. You have nothing?
I submitted stuff in writing.
John,
Yes.
can you go to the,
Yeah, go up there and state your name, Mr.
John
Bennett.
Bennett for the applicant. We're here to hear the neighbors.
Okay, fine, thank you. Anyone else?
Good evening, board members. Jeff Bradman for the Mangers and the Michael Checks. We're going to start with some experts that you've heard from already. We're going to start with Michael Goldblum, and we'll go on from there. I've got a few other people to introduce you to. Michael?
Thank you.
Hi,
State your name, please.
my name is Michael Goldblum.
Thank you.
I really didn't have an extensive amount to present to you in addition to what we talked about last time. I did have an opportunity to look at the information that Mr. Bennett submitted, and I can address that a little bit if you would like. I also saw the SPS letter there, the Historic Preservationists letter. And we also got some renderings from Mr. Stott, local architect, who was part of our group last time, who was able to help us visualize the proposed house. And we thought that that would be something worth looking at. So if I could ask that these be entered in. Let me keep one of them, actually.
Copies for us. I don't want to run into
I
the
think,
same
I think
thing we
there,
went
I
through
think
last
there are additional copies. Sure, I don't have it right here, but Mr. Bragman does.
I've got 5 here.
So these are, sure. Right, that, I have, I thought there's 5 there already.
Mr. Bennett has requested
Right, so why
one.
don't you? All right, so these are pretty straightforward. They just show,
could you hold on 1 second? so
sure,
we all
I'm sorry.
get-
We're noisy.
Is there more?
Quite all right.
Yes, it's coming. So sorry.
Additional ones?
And one for Mr. Bennett. There you go. Almost. No, it's you.
There you go.
I got it. For both.
Oh, great. There you go. Want one? Thank you, Mike. Mr. Stott prepared these, so I can't personally speak to the process by which he did it, but I assume he used the same drawings that were part of the record as the application, and they just show different angles of the house and how it's visible. The second page is an aerial view I think this is fairly familiar to you, but I think at least from my vantage point, I had not seen visualizations like this that compare the bulk and the views of the house from different vantage points. The third page shows the view from Fairleigh, as does the fourth. The fifth page is more of a kind of an aerial view. It just gives you a sense of the bulk. I don't think it's anything that warrants a whole lot of verbiage. And just to be very brief in responding to some of the comments that Mr. Bennett and Mr. Snodgrass wrote, I think that both letters or both documents seemed to boil down to a very basic point. They both relied on an argument that we talked about last time, which is that Fairleigh, because of its density, because of its anomaly as to lot size and house placement and verticality and lots of other factors, is a place that the board should not, or in Mr. Bennett's words, cannot look at in determining the character of the neighborhood. I would, as I did last time, argue that that's not for any of us to say but you. I think that from my viewpoint, context begins at the site being considered and radiates out. If one had a row of 5 single-story houses and then a 4-story house 5 down, and then another 12 4-story houses 5 down, and you were building in the middle of the row of 1-story houses, I don't think anyone would say the fact that there's a preponderance of 4-story houses down there really overwhelms and outweighs the significance of the 1-story houses here where you're building today. And I think that's a similar case here. This site is between Fairleigh's western side and the rest of Gin Lane to the west, which has 2 large houses on it. And it's the job of the applicant, it's the job of anyone proposing a historic structure or a new structure in a historic site to grapple with the context and propose a building that is contextually appropriate in that specific context there. So I think that by saying that the west side of Fairleigh is an outlier and therefore should be disregarded, and that the larger context of the block or the district as a whole should outweigh that, and one should not consider those outliers as context in considering appropriateness, I think is an argument that I certainly have never seen. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me from a simple contextual approach. The guidelines say it very clearly that you're supposed to not have jarring juxtapositions. The district is supposed to flow, things are supposed to relate to one another. And so part of the challenge of building in a historic district is to get a real feel of the granular quality of your site and make it work. It's like the chair was just saying about the Ayers house. Because of its placement on that stretch of road and how it was angled, it minimized its impact, and it was particularly appropriate to that site. And I think that this house should be held to the same standard. There were a few other things that I guess I could comment on. Mr. Bennett noted that 28 Gin Lane should be compared with the other neighbors besides Fairleigh, and he specifically cited 22 and 16 Gin Lane, 22 Gin Lane, and these are again his numbers, or the numbers that he put forth in the record via his consultants. 22 Gin Lane is 7,500 square feet and has a 4,000 square foot footprint. 16 has a 9,600 square foot size and a 7,500 square foot footprint, both strikingly smaller than the proposed house. And I think that the only other point I would make, Mr. Bennett's letter goes to some length, so to speak, to talk about how many of the houses are quite long on the block. And our table showed that and acknowledged that. But one thing that I think is interesting to note, it didn't, he didn't say that our analysis was grossly incorrect in terms of the averages and comparing them. He was just saying that contextually, you should really look at these houses over here, which are very long. The one thing I did want to note is that, as far as I can tell, 28 Gin Lane is the only house on the block of that dimension where the dimension runs north-south. And if you look at, my recollection of looking at the block is that the majority of the very long houses run east-west, parallel to the beach, more or less, which makes a kind of sense. Now, obviously, in this case, they couldn't do that because the site was a long and narrow site. But from a contextual point of view, the massing of long houses on this block is almost always east-west in axis. So I think, just looking at the aerial view that's in the package from Mr. Stott, looking at the site plan in context of the block, the house stands out. The house stands out as being very large in its place and kind of impacted up against these smaller, more closely spaced houses. I would also note that the comments that I had made last time about the inappropriateness of the south facade design elements, the inappropriateness of the west facade's depth, and the degree of fill was not commented on by either of their experts, so I assume they agree. Thank you.
No. I don't agree, because you don't agree.
If you're going to speak, Mr. Bennett, you need to step up.
Respond to that.
Let's go in the order.
Yes,
Let's go in
be
the order.
nice.
It's now the objectants and the public, and we can, and John can have his turn when it's his turn. Let's keep some order here.
Your name, please.
Yes, good evening. My name is Misha Hunter-Burkett, Lee Saltzman Architects, Historic Preservation Consultant to the Mangers and the Michaelcheks for 28 Gin Lane. And I wanted to thank the board for allowing me to speak before you this evening about this project and having this chance to address the board on the proposed development at 28 Gin Lane. In making, actually, I wanted to just introduce by saying that in my last presentation on the 11th February, I presented, I thought, a rather in-depth discussion about the history of the site. And that pertained to both 24 and 28 Gin Lane. But for the sake of brevity, I wanted to not repeat that presentation again for you this evening, even though my understanding is that both lots are still separate and that the board is acting separately on both applications. So that being said, my understanding that in making an appropriateness and compatibility determination, the board must find the new proposed construction at 28 Gin Lane to be compatible with the character of nearby properties in the Village of Southampton Historic District. My analysis suggests that the proposed new development is neither compatible with the character of nearby historic properties nor with the character of recently constructed properties in the district. And I have an image here. I don't know if that can be seen. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You don't have a copy of what you're reading, do you?
No, I don't. but I will be happy to submit my written testimony to the record as I did for 24.
For future reference, it makes it easier for me, at
It's
least,
much
to
easier.
follow along and make notes. It's a little harder to follow what you're speaking to, but we'll work with it.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I'm rather new to presenting in front of your board, so please forgive
Please
me.
continue. I can listen.
Thank you. The National Register nomination for the Village of Southampton Historic District explicitly states that the district's authenticity of place is rooted in its character-defining features, and I quote, "The district retains a cohesive, uniformly picturesque historic setting. Each residential neighborhood has uniform setbacks and generously planted landscape lots, and conveys an overall uniformity of building materials. The majority of residences are wood-framed and sheathed in clapboard or wood shingles. The summer colony typically consisted of a large, handsome main house, dependencies such as cottages, a garage, and support buildings, and a large, generously landscaped parcel," end quote. In making its determination, the board must find 28 Gin Lane to be appropriate in its general design, character, and appropriateness, scale, and siting, both in relation to the property to itself, surrounding properties, and the neighborhood, as well as visual compatibility. Applying these criteria, the proposed main house at 28 Gin Lane is not appropriate and does not conform with the village's established appropriateness criteria. As the board is aware, its determination of appropriateness for the proposed main house at 28 Gin Lane is also informed by the architectural design guidelines, which urge that, and I quote, "New construction should be made harmonious with its immediate historic surroundings. New construction should reflect the characteristic scale, massing, rhythm, proportions, and building traditions of the environs," unquote. Section 12 of the guidelines outlines the process for new construction, including principles of scale, orientation, siting, roof forms, and massing. Can I get figure number 2, please? Thank you. Thank you.
Hopeless. Okay.
Excellent, thank you. The scale of the applicant's proposed main house at 28 Gin Lane is of primary concern here before this board. The guidelines define scale as, and I quote, "the relationship of its size and architectural details through the dimensions of the human body. Buildings throughout the 4 historic districts have a human scale, where door and window openings, story heights, dimensions, and details are all in proportion to the human body. The scale of new buildings and their features should be in harmony with the scale of the surrounding historic buildings and the street in general," unquote. As was noted by Supreme Court Justice Pastoressa in his 2018 New York State Supreme Court decision, and I quote, "The respondents contended that scale is not the same as size or square footage, but scale requires a consideration of the size of a structure in relation to other things. Thus, the board may consider the size of the proposed dwelling as it relates to the property itself, surrounding properties, and the neighborhood," unquote. Mr. Joel Snodgrass, the historic preservation consultant retained by Mr. Schleifer, spoke at some length about the issue of scale in his testimony before this board on the 28th of January, and I took the time to listen to that and watch it on the YouTube video, and it was very instructive. In his testimony, Mr. Snodgrass repeatedly referred to the main house as, I quote, very large, sizable, and admitted that it would not be truthful to say that this is not a big building, unquote. He also argued that, I quote, the house was designed in a way to try to reduce its size, and, I quote, the size of the house is reduced by the shingle style, by how characteristics of that style are expressed, with an intentional process to scale this down, unquote. The architect may have tried to articulate the enormous 14,561 square foot house with human scaled door and window openings and floor heights. However, I found that there is no clear sense of hierarchy in this ramblingly expansive pile of a house. As I have heard from prior testimony, and as well as reading letters of opposition, I am aware that both several board members, as well as nearby neighbors and other village residents, are opposed and are concerned about the excessive size of the proposed main house at 28 Gin Lane. Ultimately, however, I find that Mr. Snodgrass's claim that the scale of the proposed house is appropriate because of the employment of stylistic details to try to scale down the large size of his client's house do not hold water. And I would ask, can architectural detailing and styling alone mitigate the proposed project's overly large scale? And I would urge the board to think about this. In my view, it does not. And I have figure number 3, please. Thank you. Thank you. Further, Mr. Snodgrass's argument that, I quote, the main house fits within the context of buildings that are here, and that it is in keeping with buildings to the west may be convenient for the applicant, but is troublesome when one considers Chapter 65, as well as the design guidelines. I could find nowhere in either the village code or the design guidelines where one is allowed to pick and choose selectively what context you want to choose when designing new construction within a historic district. The context of the proposed development at Gin Lane includes both the buildings to the east and to the west within this block bounded by Gin Lane and the ocean, and I forget the name of the street immediately.
Plains, I think.
Yes, that's exactly it, within this historic district. Certainly, Mr. Snodgrass acknowledged that the proposed main house is larger than the neighboring houses on Fairlea. Can I have figure number 4, please? That's great. And I just wanted to bring the board's attention again to Mr. Goldblum's documents that he had presented in his contextual analysis before the board at the last hearing. And Mr. Goldblum, who I understand went through a tremendous effort in gathering this data and a tremendous due diligence, that his quantitative analysis demonstrates the architect's design of the proposed main house is 75% larger than the average of those on Fairlea and is 63% larger than this block. Further, the footprint of the proposed main house is 113% larger than the average of those houses on Fairleigh and 96% larger than the block. So this, I find that this data, when considered together, is very telling. The proposed house is undeniably mammoth in its size and in its footprint, vastly outstripping its neighbors. It is an extremely spread out house, as Mr. Goldblum has also described, and it is not in harmony with either the scale of the surrounding historic or newly constructed buildings within this block. As designed, the main house does not comply, in my reading, of Chapter 65 of the Village Code or the guidelines in terms of its scale. Can I have figure number 5, please? I wanted to reintroduce Mr. Stott's images, which Mr. Goldblum previously brought before the board. The guidelines observe that, and I quote, "Most buildings in the village are oriented to the public street or road rather than oriented inward. This is even true of historic properties along the beachfront," unquote. This is certainly true of both historic as well as recently constructed houses on Gin Lane and Fairleigh within this block. Unfortunately, the applicant's proposed main house is not oriented towards the public street. Instead, the house is consciously oriented towards a central court. Or, as Mr. Goldblum had previously described, the walls of the house create a grand outdoor room, or a central court, unquote. The multi-car garages with staff housing above would frame a 2-story portal through which one would drive, which would then lead to this courtyard and 6 parking spaces before being able to traverse a walkway that would lead to the front door of the main house. This inward focus is an anomalous typology, both in terms of extant historic buildings as well as newer construction on this block in this historic district. As such, the proposed residence would not conform with the guidelines criterion with regards to orientation. Can I have figure number 6, please? Thank you. The guidelines also offer direction with regards to siting, and the principle with regards to siting bears repeat mention here as a reminder of the historic context within which 28 Gin Lane is proposed to be developed, and I quote, "Early 19th and 20th century builders and architects maintained a basic respect for their surroundings and for historic continuity, and that historic architecture respects the relationship of buildings to the street and to each other. Instead, Southampton's residential neighborhoods retain a regular setback and regular spacing to preserve a sense of visual unity," unquote. Such cannot be said of the proposed design for an elongated or attenuated, narrow, courtyard-shaped main house that does not maintain a regular setback or spacing from either its neighbors and will not preserve a visual sense of unity within the block. In Mr. Goldblum's exhibit, where he quantified the distances between the proposed 28 Gin Lane development and the surrounding residential buildings that currently exist within this block, has previously been presented and described to this board as part of his prior testimony. Mr. Snodgrass also noted in his January 28th testimony that, and I quote, "If you have the ability to build something like this, you need the ability to have the amount of land to do it in. Otherwise, You really are jamming things in," unquote. Arguably, the applicant is actually proposing to do just that, jam things in with a gigantic, spread-out house on a flagpole lot. 28 Gin Lane, therefore, in my reading, does not conform with the guidelines citing criterion. Can I have figure number 7? The guidelines recommend that, I quote, "where one form and pitch predominates, follow the neighborhood pattern. Where there is a range of roof form and pitch, do not introduce a new variant." I would argue that the massive roof of this attenuated or elongated main house, which is over 200 feet long, almost as long as a New York City block, is broken down in the applicant's design, but it looks fragmented. The proposed roof form does not follow any neighborhood pattern within this block in this historic district. In his January 28th testimony before the board, the architect characterized the roof lines of the main house as, he quote, as he said, energetic, which may be necessary in light of the vast expanse of roof surface that he had to deal with. However, energetic is not commonly used to describe shingle-style houses. And I will add that I took some time to read several books by Mr. Vincent Scully, who is a known authority on the shingle style, and did not find anywhere in his descriptions of roof styles of the many buildings that he studied, both for his PhD dissertation and then several other subsequent publications, the word energetic. So I just wanted to put that out there. Can I have figures 8 and 9? Instead, what I did find by looking at the hundreds of examples that were studied by Mr. Scully is that shingle-style houses have a volumetric quality to them, where a single volume, such as a gable, is punctuated by some smaller volumes, whether they be smaller gables or dormers. And some examples, rather than take the board's time by showing many, I just selected 2. One is McKim, Mead & White's William G. Low House, and then also Thomas Hastings' sketches for a country house. And I would say that neither of these roof lines could be defined as energetic, and instead you can really feel this organic quality, the way that the houses are carefully articulated, massed, and the roof lines are quite simple and carefully scaled to the house. Can I have figure 10, please?
Before you do that, Charlie, I'm sorry, could you leave the first one there? Yeah, that one. Could you just put it down? And Charlie, could you zoom in on that? We don't have this figure,
We
so
don't have that one.
I'd like
Oh,
to
I'm
just
sorry.
see this one
Okay.
on the screen if I could. And that's an example of,
This is an
Articulated
example of this very simple roof line that, in this case, really defined almost the entire massing of the house. But that was something that was very, very significant when Mr. Scully was talking about the shingle style. Did you have any further?
That's labeled figure 8, but the submission you made has a different figure.
Sherman House.
I'm so sorry. I'm very
Can you
sorry.
explain this one?
Sure, actually.
Sorry, just for the record, that house is the William,
We have
William G. Low House.
Thank you very
Oh,
much.
okay.
Okay.
I think there was a different version of the PowerPoint that got distributed, and
In a different one.
Yep.
Well, this, where's,
and then the other one is the Sini House,
correct.
which was constructed in Bernardsville in New Jersey. And that was another example that Mr. Scully spoke about in terms of, I think, a compactness and really still allowing for a lot of definition with volumes, while still allowing this compactness in a multi-story residential dwelling within this shingle style articulation. Can I continue? Sure. Thank you. In trying to break down the volume at 28 Gin Lane, the overwhelmingly large size of the house suggests that the architect selected a module for a finite portion of the house and pressed repeat on a horizontal plane. And I thought of this when I was looking at this section here, where if you look at this and then think that sort of pressing repeat over here and here, I mean, it started to feel like it was reading like a repetition horizontally. And this is actually a common critique more of skyscrapers that can lack articulation in the shaft between the base and the terminus. But I was thinking of this as a flip onto the horizontal plane. I think that the lack of hierarchy in the architect's design actually adds to this problem. And I would submit that the house does not conform to the architectural design guidelines in terms of its roof form. Further, in his testimony before the board on January 28th, the architect stated that the varying roof profiles and contrasting volumes look as if the house had been added to over time, unquote. In fact, the architect's comment goes against one of the cardinal rules of historic preservation, which does not condone having a false sense of history. In fact, the Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties sternly warns against creating any false sense of historical development. This is also affirmed in the Village Code, which expressly asks the board to consider the standards when evaluating the principle of compatibility. The question here before the board is a matter of appropriateness, not creating any distorted impression that this may have been a building that was added to over a period of years. Last, I'll move on to massing, where the guidelines instruct that, I quote, "New construction should follow the general massing of surrounding buildings," unquote. Thank you. The surrounding buildings on the block, as has been described before this board, consists of freestanding houses surrounded by landscaping. In fact, Mr. Goldblum noted that the average maximum length of a house on Fairleigh was 95 feet and 107 feet on the block. The architect's design for 28 Gin Lane is a house that is 216 feet long, which is 127% larger than Fairleigh and 102% larger than the block. The exaggerated attenuation or overly long design is unquestionably inconsistent with its neighbors and non-compliant with the guidelines. And I think that Mr. Goldblum's point that he just made previously this evening is also very telling, in that if these historic homes were long, they were oriented towards the street. But in this case, the architect has rotated the proposed house to be perpendicular to the street due to the constraints of the lot. Regarding the shingle style, again, we can learn from Mr. Scully, who noted in his book, The Architecture of the American Summer, which I particularly enjoyed, where he says, unquote, "Beginning with Richardson in 1874 came this new openness and liveliness, which was to characterize the shingle style throughout its history." The author goes on to describe this organic quality of shingle-style houses, where there is nevertheless a marvelously lifelike connection between plan, section, and massing, unquote. Unfortunately, I would submit such cannot be said of the proposed design at 28 Gin Lane. I won't go through the STOT images again, but just leave this one for the moment. Thank you very much. Other than to say that when I looked at these earlier today, I was impressed by the way that the proposed house would really loom over its neighbors. And of course, I don't want to go through all of those images before you again this evening. In sum, I would submit that 28 Gin Lane is inappropriate as a new construction in the context of the historic district based upon an inappropriate scale, design, visual compatibility, character, and proportion. It is not compliant with the criteria of appropriateness as outlined in Chapter 65, nor does it comply with the criteria set forth in the architectural design guidelines. As I stated previously in my testimony on 24 Gin Lane, there is nothing to preserve on the site of either 24 or 28. However, Chapter 65 requirements and the guidelines are clear that new construction must carefully respond to the existing historic context. And in conjunction with the features that create that context, new construction must strive to preserve the historic character that remains within this historic district. Moreover, the guidelines warn that, I quote, "New construction in a historic district can either complement adjacent historic buildings or can erode the established character of the surrounding neighborhood," unquote. If approved as currently designed, the proposed development at 28 Gin Lane would erode the established character of surrounding neighborhood on this block within this historic district. And I would submit that it would diminish the special architectural and historic character of this block within this historic district. As I stated previously, within the matter of 24 Gin Lane, no one is denying the possibility of development on 28 Gin Lane. We simply urge the board to adhere to its mandate to ensure harmonious, orderly, and efficient growth and development, and direct the applicant to revise their design to better conform with the appropriateness criteria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Misha. Richard Handler, 50 Broadway, Amityville, for the Manger and Michael Check families. I'd like to call upon Sarah Kautz to address the board. Sarah is the Preservation Director of Preservation Long Island, formerly known as the Society for the Preservation of Long Island Antiquities. She's had the pleasure of appearing before this board in the past. Sarah is a former consultant with the Museum of the City of New York, and in particular, a specific consultant with respect to computerization of programs on behalf of the New York City Landmark Commission, a job she held for 3 years. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thanks very much. I have a few copies of my letter that I sent. It's dated February 11th, and I emailed it. So I think you should have copies, but I have a few. Okay, great.
I have a copy. We never got it.
It was in the
emailed to
file.
the village. Never received. You have an extra copy?
Sure.
I dealt with extra copy.
Well, she's passing out, how many do you have?
Just one.
That's fine.
Oh, there's more.
This was in the file.
I sent it to, did you receive it?
It was in the file.
It was, okay, great.
Did you finish?
Again, my name is Sarah Kautz. I'm the Preservation Director at Preservation Long Island. I'm not going to really talk about the structure itself because my colleagues have done a great job kind of getting into the details of what's going on with the structure, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what could be changed to make it more appropriate. And I would say that we, in general, concur and support those the testimony of my two colleagues. Also, I just want to reiterate that we're not against new things in the historic district or any historic district. We are the regional advocate for historic preservation, so I work really across Long Island in many historic districts throughout Long Island. And one thing that sometimes folks lose sight of is, in getting into the specifics of a particular project, the wider picture of a district at large, of a village or a town at large, and a region like Long Island. So I just want to point out again, there's also not just about this particular property, and there are some things that could be, tweaked and addressed, and it could be improved. And I think the neighbors have also expressed interest in, it's not that they're totally against this, they just want to see some things changed, and that's where we would come in as well. But there is a wider picture here. Again, I think I mentioned this last time, the painting behind you, we're kind of right in that area. The 28 Gin Lane is, it would be to the east of where we're standing. It would be visible. This is the heart of the historic district, and this district, again, as I mentioned in a previous hearing, is globally famous. People come from around the world to see what's on the wall behind you, and to walk the beach and walk Gin Lane. And these structures would be visible from the public points of view. And the view sheds of this fabulous historic district are so important. They're special around the world. Like I said, people treasure this place and the view shed. So, there's a lot to be said about the specifics of this site that could be tweaked, but also thinking in terms of the view sheds and the wider historic district as a whole and the impacts that this project could have. And I think at this point where we are at right now, it is very oversized, it's out of scale, there's a lot of reasons why it's not in character, and the previous testimony has gotten into that in detail. But I would also encourage you to think about how change has been introduced to the historic district. So has it been gradual, or is it very rapid? And is it minimal, or is it very intensive? And in terms of these two properties that didn't exist until very recently, the lots themselves were created recently. There was existing structures that were about 100 years old, and they were demolished. So that was a big change in and of itself. I know 24 Gin Lane has been closed, but there was nothing built there. And what's going to be constructed on 28 Gin Lane is going to be very different than what was there previously for the last 100 years. So that's really going to introduce a very aggressive, impactful change to this part of the district. And also, in general, the kinds of change that are being introduced in the district as a whole and in historic districts across Long Island. And just what does that change look like? What is the pace? How intense is it? And that's what I would encourage you guys to just consider as well. Yeah. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff Bragman again for the Manger and Michaelchuk family. We asked Steve Schneider to join us tonight. He's a professional engineer with some familiarity with the project, was involved in the first round. And he's here to talk about the issue that has not been talked about very much, and that is the question of placing fill on the property from about 2 to 4 feet of fill. We've heard various explanations about why this has to be done. One of the explanations is that the septic system required it. I think that was the explanation that was finally settled on, and we brought Steve in to talk about that. So.
Yes, we do.
I'll be very brief.
Fine. I'm interested.
My name is Stephen Schneider, Schneider Engineering, 1 Comac, C-O-M-A-C, Loop, Suite 1B4, Ronkonkoma, New York, 11779. I do have a copy of a letter I prepared actually a year ago I don't know if you had seen it. I don't think, absolutely.
Thank you, Steve. Good to see you. How are you?
Excuse me, sir, what's the date of the letter?
It's actually February 7th, 2018. But nothing has changed on the fill issue, to my knowledge. And based, it's very short, so I'm not going to be standing here too long. But in either case, we were asked to determine if the proposed retaining wall of 7 feet from the base of the foundation was required in order to place an appropriate sanitary system on the subject property. An acceptable depth for the proposed sanitary system could be placed at the ground level and go to a depth of 9 feet below the ground level. This would easily allow the septic tank and leaching galley to both be put in place without having to build a retaining wall above ground level. A depth of 9 feet for the sanitary system is also not even required. There are other systems that are out there that have been used locally and nationally. One, for example, would be what's called an ADS system. It's basically, believe it or not, plastic pipes that have perforations in them, and that can be put down as deep as 4 feet, so that nothing near a retaining wall of 7 feet would be actually required. So there are systems out there that can, in fact, handle this type of usage, especially with the sandy soil that's there now, and not need or require that retaining wall. That's the whole story.
Yeah, so that's so diametrically opposed to what we've been told. I don't understand.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
That 4 feet of fill was going to be put in, or 2 feet?
They had a 7-foot wall was going to be put in.
And there was some other discussion. I talked to the building inspector about it, but it had to do with how the house sits on the land. So you're saying that it's not necessary, should there be any wall?
No, not at all. It's not necessary at all.
And in this is a VE zone, do you know that? Which is a high velocity, it's the biggest buildup by FEMA? Okay, you know that? Okay.
Well, I guess the question, and maybe you're getting at this, Susan.
I'm trying to, but I don't understand it very well, I'm sorry.
What is the concern about the fill? Is it, or the wall? What's the impact to what we have jurisdiction over and authority over, which is the scale, you know, the look, the compatibility, the same thing that the other folks were talking about?
It's actually, what it does is it raises the height of the house higher above all the others. And by not putting fill in for 7 feet, for example, you don't have to put the house that high. It's lower, it's on the ground level.
John, so what we were told, and John, let everybody speak, what we were told by the building department, and I'm not making a stance one way or the other, I'm just repeating what we've been told by the building department, and the various people involved can argue one way or the other, that the fill had in fact no impact on the height of the house, that the height of the house was a matter of the FEMA regulations based on height above sea level. Now, I don't know what the heck I'm talking about in terms of being a PE, but all I can, that's okay, other people have told me that, including some of the people in this room. But the point is, I appreciate what you're saying. At the same time, the building inspector has said it doesn't have an impact on the house. The truth is somewhere. And so all I'm acknowledging, I'm hearing what you're saying, I'm hearing what the building department is saying, and maybe that's where we leave it for the purposes of this evening, in terms of the fill. And then we'll just have to perhaps go back to the building department and analyze that point a bit more.
Well, we should probably go back and show them.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I'm as confused as I was before. But that's okay, I appreciate your information.
That's why I'm here.
We're having there's obviously a disagreement about where this is all going to be played out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Members of the board, Richard Handler, 50 Broadway. I just want to supplement some of the points that Mr. Schneider was making and clarify why this issue is being raised again. At the risk of repeating things that this board has heard over and over, not only in connection with this application, but also probably every application that comes before you, so no one knows your code better than you do. But I must emphasize, in the context of the fill, in the context of the wall, what the primary concern is of this board with respect to a certificate of appropriateness. And if you would permit me to quote a certain section of Section 65.4 with respect to the focus of the board. The code says, "No person shall carry out any exterior alteration, moving of structure, land, trees, or plantings upon property." So the moving of land is a relevant factor before you. It's true it's not a structure, but your board's mission is not only to consider structures, it's to consider impacts upon the land. And the filling, the providing of 4 additional feet of fill, however it might be appropriate for purposes of a septic system or not, nevertheless, the fact is that it's an addition to the land and it is having an impact on the land, and therefore it falls within your jurisdiction. The Department of Health may say it's okay. The Village Building Department may say it's okay, but your responsibility is an additional level of regulatory review, and you're not subject to the Suffolk County Department of Health. You're not subject necessarily to the building department. You're subject to your own view of the impact on this project as it relates to the surrounding properties, the land itself, and the historic district. And your charge is to measure the impact of any alteration, not only with respect to structures, but with respect to land, trees, and plantings. And the addition of 4 feet of additional fill is a significant addition to that land and affects its vision from the public, from the beach, and from the height of the house. I'd like to submit portions of a transcript taken on July 25th, 2017, with respect to this subject in the prior hearings, and if I can submit these to the board, I'd appreciate that.
I would just note that there has been an absolute objection. I don't really care if he puts it in, but note the hypocrisy of the absolute objection to any previous submission from anybody regarding the prior hearings, which was, of course, a foolish statement to make, but you should make Mr. Handel live by it.
There was no,
Let's just not go continue, please. Mr. Bennett, could we just let one person speak at a time, please?
I have to respond to that. First of all, I'm not used to being referred to as a hypocrite. Okay. But besides that, the board did not have a wholesale prohibition against other matters coming in from the prior hearing.
They just had to be resubmitted.
Thank you.
It just had to be resubmitted. He resubmitted it.
It's testimony.
Selected testimony.
I thought what came from the clerk said that he didn't believe that testimony was necessarily included. That's the point that your team brought up, I thought.
Anyway,
absolutely.
Well, sir, it depended on what the nature of the testimony was. The testimony I'm about to submit is testimony from Mr. Hollander respecting this very matter with respect to the wall and with respect to the fill. And to that extent, it's the council's testimony, not mine, and I'm just supplementing and submitting something that they submitted in the last hearing. So if they submitted it in the last hearing, well, then that should be good enough. Certainly not
part of this hearing. I'm sorry. I've said my piece.
It doesn't matter because they're testifying or presenting an issue of fill, and whether I had that piece or not, I want to hear discussion about the fill.
I'm speaking, I'm using the words of Mr. Hollander.
So what? It's testimony. You objected to any testimony.
That's not true, Mr. That's not true.
He's making a statement today, not in the past, John.
I'm assuming he's changed his prior position. So
no, I haven't.
Okay, hey, guys, just cut it and let's go on, okay?
This submission relates to Mr. Hollander's testimony on July 24th of 2017. And in particular, I'd like to draw the board's attention to page 107 with respect to the wall. Mr. Hollander, and I'll summarize this, and I'll direct the board's attention to pages 107, 108, 109, 112, 113, 114, and 115. And the subject of Mr. Hollander's testimony, and it's sworn testimony in there, or it's testimony in there you are, was that there was approximately 400 foot of wall that was built in order to accommodate the septic system. And I believe these questions came about as the chair's inquiries with respect to the need to the wall. Mr. Hollander stated that the fill was inserted based on the original house plan, and that after the house plan was changed, and the fill had already been placed in there, that approximately 1/3 of that fill and 1/3 of that wall was unnecessary. And I would respectfully submit that based on that testimony of Mr. Hollander, and based upon his statements that the fill was inserted based on the prior plan, based on the original iteration that was presented to this board, that 1/3 of that wall is no longer appropriate, and that 1/3 of that fill on the south side of that property is no longer appropriate. And those statements in particular are at pages 112, 113, 114, and 115 of the transcript that I submitted, and I respectfully ask the board to go through that, and you will see that that was Mr. Hollander's comments, not my witness, Mr. Bennett's. Thank you.
Maybe Mr. Holland, could we,
Does anybody else?
yeah, they're coming, but I'd like to hear what Mr. Holland has. He's here. Okay, I agree.
Jeff Bragman for the objecting neighbors. I just wanted to make a couple comments on the Snodgrass memo, which we just got, because they're kind of ignored in the discussion, and I think they're worth considering. Essentially, he makes an argument, and it's a lengthy argument in his memo, that size was properly considered in the prior hearings, and that the prior review was made in good faith, followed the approach that he suggests that objective criteria be used to decide these kinds of issues, and that given the fact that the board acted within the correct framework and the correct procedures as well, that the conclusions that were previously made were, quote, reasonably derived and sound in theory. And he also goes on to say, so all this board can do on this next go-round is re-examine the scale. And then he proceeds to somewhat obscure the definition of scale, frankly, by not quoting the design guidelines, and he suggests that scale is it's relative, and it's a kind of a more abstruse concept than size, that it's different from size. And based on all of that, he basically is telling the board that the prior decision by your architectural consultant was absolutely correct, that everything you did was correct, and all you got to do now is look at scale. He omits quoting the definition of scale in the design guidelines, which describes it as the overall dimensions of a building defined at scale. Logical, common sense. So when you know from the design guidelines that scale means size. It's the size of a building in comparison to the human body. And the guidelines also go on and say scale is one of the most important features in determining compatibility and setting, and they also say that a stark contrast in scale between adjacent buildings is usually disruptive. The reason I bring it up is because this is an argument virtually identical to an argument that his attorney made and lost in the court, and we discussed in this when we began these hearings on January 28th. And it's wrong. And the idea that the boards can rely on its procedures and decisions and the prior statements of its architectural consultant are also wrong. And the reason that they're wrong is because I'm not going to quote testimony from the prior hearings, but we were repeatedly hectored, advised, and warned that we could not discuss. It started out with we couldn't discuss size. Then it broadened to we can't discuss mass. Then it broadened to the fact that we couldn't discuss height, size, or mass. And eventually it broadened to the idea that we couldn't discuss any dimensional requirement of zoning. I see Mr. Highsmith shaking his head. If you want, I can quote you, sir. I have the quotes right here. But my point is that
your matter of disrespect is out of control.
This is a large portion of the Snodgrass memo. It's a diversion. It's an attempt to divert the board away from looking at the plain facts about the size of this building. And those plain facts are pretty startling, and you've heard, I think, a fairly good analysis from Mr. Goldblum using not only looking at fairly. There's kind of this tendency, I think, among the proponents of this application to say, oh, it's not just fairly you have to look at, and they want to ignore fairly. They call it an outlier. It seems to be a term that's coming up a lot in reference to fairly. In actuality, an outlier is scientifically, it's a statistic. It's an oddball statistic that's way out of bounds of the general clumping of statistics. Fairly is not an outlier. It's not an oddball, odd duck exception to the rule. Fairly is what I would use another $5 word. It's a progenitor. It's a noble ancestor. It's the start of the Southampton summer colony. It's the first time that anybody had the imagination to try to create a park-like setting for 5 homes in one place specifically designed as the summer colony that eventually became. And the idea of them saying, oh, it's, you've got to ignore that because the houses are tucked together. Well, yes, they started out on an 8-acre parcel. It expanded to a 10-acre parcel. It got subdivided in the 20s under real estate pressure, and they put some more houses in. And so there is some sense to what Mr. Goldblum said when he said it's got kind of a suburban feel. But the point is that we honestly demonstrated that fairly is one context, and the larger Gin Lane block is another context. And if you look at the diagrams that Mr. Goldblum prepared, in which he showed the generous proportions of the setbacks between the larger Gin Lane homes and the other large Gin Lane homes, and also the generous setbacks between the Gin Lane homes and the Fairley homes, you get the idea of how these two contexts work together. And they go back to the design guidelines themselves, which say, some important things, mainly that historic architecture had an inherent belief in respecting its neighbors and the community. It was inherently respectful and attentive to visual unity, and that's in marked contrast to modern architecture, which is a little bit more about me. It's about my success, my power, showing what I've achieved in the world. And so calling Fairley an outlier is, I think, a way of, again, putting blinders on the board. It reminds me of the Wizard of Oz. Like, don't look to the east. Whatever you do, don't look at the man behind the curtain, because what you're going to see is it's not difficult if you look at the real issue in this case, which is size, the dimensions of the building, and you see what that 216-foot-long wall, 36 feet away from these wonderful surviving ancestors from 1878 does. That's what you should be looking at. That's the code says. You're supposed to look at nearby properties, the surrounding neighborhoods. So I just wanted to say that we're trying to present you with two straightforward, honest contexts. One of them is Fairley, and it's a remarkable surviving community. that should be acknowledged and protected. And the other one is the larger Gin Lane block, which has the larger houses and the more gracious setbacks. But the one thing that Mr. Goldblum pointed out is even those large houses generally have a nice, generous setback from the Fairleigh houses. And that's what historic architecture is all about. And so, you know, I got a little concerned when I saw the Snodgrass memo repeating this legal argument without any basis, that everything you did before was fine, and now you just have to look at scale, but don't think of scale as having size. We have to look at the scale of this house. It's the dimensions of the house. It's also the way it doesn't break that length up that's right along the eastern western border between it and Fairleigh. It's an enormous imposition. And you know, what I sense is missing in this application is any sense of restraint. It seems like in this modern age, we've completely abandoned the idea that a house that we build participates in a community and a neighborhood and should demonstrate some degree of restraint and respect. And frankly, I think that between the experts, you know, they speak they have a vocabulary, I think, that puts these factors in a way that conveys the visual impact. So I like hearing the vocabulary that they use when they say, like, the roof line isn't broken up enough. And you can see that in this building. Or when they say, you know, that it doesn't produce a cohesive whole. It's got a lot of architectural details. Misha was telling you, but it looks like they pressed the repeat button on some. And they've got, you know, the Queen Anne, they've got shingle style, I'm talking about on the larger house, and a whole bunch of other architectural details. But something is lacking cohesiveness in that building. And it I think relates to that issue of restraint. I don't see any restraint in this application. I don't see any attention and neighborliness. And those are, I'm not making these up because I want people to be polite. These are in the design guidelines. These are stated as the qualities of historic architecture. So I just want to make sure that in looking this over, that you don't get distracted by the Snodgrass memo. You don't think, oh, everything's fine and we can go along with it and we'll just look at comparative scale, which Mr. Snodgrass concluded was perfectly fine. It's time to honestly look at the facts here, look at the dimensions, look at the imposition of this house on those Fairleigh houses, and just say he can do better. He can definitely do better with not much effort. That's all I wanted to say for the moment.
May I ask a quick question? I'm just confused about, you cited a 216-foot wall that's 36 feet away from Fairleigh. I'm just having problems visualizing that on the plan.
I'm talking about the length of the wall running north-south on the 28 Gin Lane.
On the east side, there's a 216-foot wall that's 36 feet off of the property line?
I'm sorry, it's on the, some of it is 36 feet away. The longer wall, correct, is on the western side.
Okay.
But it's the length of the wall that is notable, especially as an adjacent neighbor to Fairleigh. It just seems like there should be a way to give those houses a little more breathing room. That's what historic architecture is about. That's what the guidelines talk about. That's why Fairleigh remains this beautiful little enclave that we should protect. Frankly, you know, as you see how the houses evolved, some of them are little stick houses, and then they gradually got more elaborate and turned into, you know, more sophisticated houses. It's a picture in time of the earliest development of the summer colony. And for that reason, it deserves respect and breathing room and, you know, some deference, frankly, in setbacks.
I hope I have all of this in order. This I'm handing in to you. This is a copy of what I'm saying. I only got one of each. I apologize. I didn't think to have them all. I'm sorry, I just knew I had to hand them in. I'm sorry.
As long as we can each review. Thank you.
first two, I think. This is a little bit of show and tell.
Please state your name.
I will.
Okay.
I'm just trying to get some of this. Yeah, I'll give this back to you. Okay, I think I'm set here. Okay, my name is Lynn Manger, and I'm at 10 Fairley Road. Fairley Road that you've been hearing a lot about. I want to thank you very much for allowing me this time. I'm sorry if I repeat some of the things that you've already heard. I'm not doing it intentionally. I was not aware of all of the comments and testimony that was going to be given. Charles Manger, representing the Tapadoons LLC, and I are here not only as the neighbors to 28 Gin Lane, but also, like you, the board, to preserve and protect this heart of the 1880s summer colony in the historic district in the village of Southampton. I live in a historic district in Manhattan, and I've also served on the Landmarks Preservation Foundation in New York City for over 15 years. I'm keenly interested in preserving what is the center of the summer colony in this historic district in the village of Southampton. And we, the Mangers, have been in this particular location since 1960. There are 3 documents that govern the Board of the Historic Preservation. As you know, there is the Village Code, the guidelines of the village, and also the Secretary of the Interior section of Historic Preservation. And the duties are very clearly stated. These documents stress that the overriding goal of historic preservation in the village of Southampton is to preserve the continuity with the past and not the isolation of the past. The proposed application that you have before you must meet these requirements that are stated in these documents. I feel that I'm being a bit repetitive, as I'm sure these have been quoted to you before this evening. The one, though, that I would like to mention, the features or properties which make a significant contribution to the character of this historic district shall be altered as little as possible. And in the standards for the treatment of historic properties from the Secretary of the Interior, it states that introducing new construction in historic districts that is visually incompatible or that destroys the historic relationships within the setting is not recommended. The maintenance of the village visual harmony is the overriding principle in architectural design guidelines for new construction in the historic district. Now, by bringing your attention to this first one, where the property shall be altered as little as possible, I'd like to show you the featured lawn of the McKnights as it was. And it's open to the I'm referring here to, this is our house, this is the McKnight house. Am I in the right place for you guys? Okay. Good. And this is the featured lawn, as you can see. This is the site of the summer colony around 1880, and it shows the original 18 acres that were the site of the first house built along the ocean beachfront, which is this house here. The birdcage of Dr. Thomas. This was in the heart of the historic district. The Nelson House then built the 5 original houses that made up Fairley on the adjacent property to the east. The historical evolution of the setting, where the rhythm and the spacing of the houses were forward and back along the beachfront, should be maintained. And as Southampton has become more densely populated, all efforts to maintain this historic design and spacing of houses is key to the historical design of the land. In the late 1970s, the Society of the Preservation of Long Island Antiquities, I'm sorry, they've just changed their name. I didn't have it in this. Conducted an architectural survey of much of the village pre-1940 architecture in Southampton. And this existing house is listed with the New York State Division of Historical Preservation. This one.
What's the address of that house? I'm sorry.
Well, it would now be 28 Gin Lane. And the new construction should be made harmonious with the immediate historic surroundings and should preserve the continuity with the past, neither of which this proposed house does. By reciting the proposed house, one would continue the rhythm and keep the harmony and spatial relationship with the neighboring houses, and thus giving the proposed house a permanently unobstructed view of Lake Agawam. Now, it should be noted that by constructing this wall, the retaining wall, which we've just heard about, and using the fill to raise a large portion of the original Thomas property above the neighboring properties to the east and the west, this historic setting of the land will be severely compromised, significantly and permanently altered. And I reiterate from page 61 that to avoid radically altering this site, which is important in defining the overall historic character of the property. And on the second page of the McKnight's house, I did have all this in order. I think it was in the one I submitted to you. On the second page of this historic declaration, it describes the feature of this great lawn, which I showed you twice in the historic property. It refers to this lawn here, which is being drastically altered. It will no longer look like that. Now, if you look at this picture, and I'm trying to do it upside down, I bring your attention to this elevation here. This is natural grade, this line here. This is the concrete wall. This is the fill to the top of the wall, which goes along. And this is the line. This is where the house is built, as you can see. I hope I'm clear, because I can't watch that in this at the same time. Anyway, this line, as you can see, goes to here, and it is what I call the line to nowhere, because nowhere does it show how this gets back to this natural grade over here. There is no explanation. Is there to be a wall? Is it to be graded? But nowhere does it show on this how it reaches natural grade.
Can you just give us the orientation to your...
I'm sorry, this is
the west.
This is the west side,
West side here.
west?
and this
Okay.
is the east side here.
We're looking at the north elevation there, so it's going from west to east.
Thank you. Now, these plans, which show this fill of up to 4 feet on the western side of the property, and then as I refer to this line that goes nowhere, is on the eastern side. Being on the eastern side, I am greatly concerned about the added height to the property and how this will affect the rain runoff and storm surge. In the mid-1970s, we were in the house in March when the full moon and high tides brought the ocean, took away our dune and brought the ocean up to the foundation of our patio. For 1 week, the ocean did not recede. It didn't come and go. It stayed there. We dumped in big cesspools to try and prevent it from coming forward. It didn't do too much. And it remained right by this foundation. Eventually, nature took its course and the waters receded and the tide went down. During Hurricane Sandy, the ocean took away the double dune and washed right over the patio and moved all the sandbags that we'd placed to keep the water from coming in the house. Because of these particular incidents, we are extremely concerned with the western property being raised 4 feet. And you all know that water cannot run up, so it's going to run around. And during another high tide or storm surge, this would cause flooding to our property. As these properties are in the historic district, it is important that this natural grade be maintained without question. I mean, it's not like we're all going to be able to raise our property to accommodate the 4 feet being proposed here. A refresher as to how we came to this particular design. The chairman of the board in 2017 had asked the historian, as the board was not supposed to give direction as to what give direction on what could be proposed or not proposed. So he asked the historian if he might suggest to the applicant's architect, who had asked repeatedly some way to come up with a design that would be acceptable. The historian envisioned a gatehouse with a long drive-through to focus on the main entrance of the house. And the gatehouse he envisioned was designed by Lutyens and built in England. Now, normally, the gatehouse would be situated on the streetscape, not in the middle of the property. And so you now have here, I'm not sure that this is, Gin Lane is out here, I'm sorry. Normally, if you were building gatehouses, you built it where the streetscape joins your entrance to the property. But rather, and over time, as in other places in Southampton, the garage has become then a small house in the front of the property when it got subdivided. But rather, we have a small house that's proposed over here, the guest house. Then you come back, and then you reach this, which ends up being visually, I know not in reality, but visually in the middle of this total property from Gin Lane to the ocean. Now, had this been put here, it would have been extremely effective because you would have had this wonderful long view to a house back here. But because you eliminated this part, I'm sure you all understand what I'm trying to say. In any case, this now comes in what would be the middle of this from Gin Lane to the ocean, which is not exactly what the idea of gatehouses was intended for. So the footprint of this original plan, which we saw back in early 2017, was 8,800 square feet. The footprint of this proposed plan is 8,500 square feet. And it exceeds any footprint in this historic district. And the original plan at 8,800 square feet was denied. I don't see too much difference in 8,800 and 8,500 in terms of this overall massing and stretched out, elongated house. So for some of the details, the massing size and scale are obviously a major issue and have been addressed by others. Suffice it to say the house is too big to be compatible or in harmony with the house that is, the houses that surround it. I have here, this shows how Gin Lane and the ocean and the houses were originally designed this way. This house now is proposed, as you can see, is right up here. I did want to just show you that this was the proposed original house, and this is the one that's only 300 square feet smaller in terms of its footprint. The individuality of the houses that are surrounded by open space has been completely lost. Should the house be approximately 11,000 square feet, it would still be larger than any of the others, and if designed with the village code and historic district guidelines firmly in mind, we would really all be much happier. And we'd be all, we wouldn't be here today if that's why we'd started. And the southern facade, which I would like to state categorically, the public will see from the beach. You can see the beach from the house, and if you can see the beach from the house, the beach can see back. You can see the Michaelcheck house, the Kraus house, and even our small cottage is visible from the beach. All of these are set further back than this proposed house. The southern facade on the proposed house is definitely a contemporary take on a historic house. Neither the pergolas on the second floor deck nor the glass railing running the length of the second floor deck are materials that would have been used and should be considered inappropriate for this historic site. And as an aside, the owner has stated many times his strong desire to see the ocean, and yet from his second floor bedroom, he faces the roof of the pool house. And he closes off his view from the first floor with a large wall housing a staircase. Now, I must say, what is wrong with this house, as has been discussed by many experts, is definitely not appropriate nor compatible for the historic district, and definitely not for 28 Gin Lane. It does not fit any of the criteria of the principles of historic design in scale, proportion, rhythm, siting, balance, or massing. Those are the criteria that are in your guideline. I urge you, the members of this board, to help us in guiding the owner to arrive at a design that addresses all of these concerns. And I urge you, the Board for Historic Preservation, to please not set an irreversible precedent and destroy the heart of this summer colony and the oldest area that remains in the historic district in Southampton. Thank you very much for your time. I gave it to you. That's in the green envelope I gave you. Yes, and then the letters. Mark, why don't you start? No. You're going to talk about the petitions, and then you're going to have to, so you're great. Move it along, because I'm ready to just have to be here all night.
Oh, okay. Okay, this is to these notes.
Good evening. My name is Mark London. I'm here as a homeowner in the village, but more
Address,
as...
please.
Southampton Village.
No.
Where in the village?
We're in the village,
40
standing.
Cobblefield Lane.
Excuse me. Oh, thank you.
40 Cobblefield Lane. But I'm here speaking as president of Wickapog Homeowners Association, which is known as Cobblefield. In case you're unfamiliar with Cobblefield, it consists of 25 homes on 25 acres located between the high school and Wickapog Road on the west side of Narrow Lane. Within our association, we have architectural restrictions on all construction and landscaping that are contained in our bylaws. The purpose of our architectural guidelines is to maintain a neighborhood of harmonious architectural style that fits within the character of the community. When our homeowners association board receives a plan for a new home, we typically share that proposal before the board approves it or denies it with the immediate neighbors. To the extent that there's any disagreement, we, the board, strongly encourage the parties to reach agreement on their own. However, the board retains the right for the final say. This strategy works very well for us as it preserves the architectural character of our neighborhood. It generally preserves the peace within our neighborhood and still provides us with enough flexibility as to not result in a cookie-cutter look of 25 identical homes within our property. I know our board frequently finds itself in the same position as this board does, which is one of being asked to consider for approval plans for a home on effectively a one-off or standalone basis. Often, our natural tendency is to look at the plans in these situations and say, oh, hey, that doesn't look so bad. However, we as an association board constantly have to remind ourselves to resist this temptation. As a homeowner board, it is our fiduciary responsibility to not only consider a proposal on its individual design characteristics, but we must also give equal consideration to how the proposed home and landscaping impacts the long-term character and architectural harmony of the neighborhood, as well as its impact on the immediate neighbors within our neighborhood. I'm here tonight because I wanted to share with this board our experience and our approach to a common dilemma and encourage you to avoid considering plans without giving strong consideration to their impact on the neighborhood, especially in the heart of the Village Historical District. Thank you for your attention.
Charles Manger, 12 Fairley Road in Southampton. Chairwoman Stevenson, board members, Mr. Bruin, and Mr. Studenroth. Good evening. Again, I'm Charles Manger. I'm the son of Dr. and Mrs. William Manger. I've been in the village of Southampton for 49 years, almost half a century. I would like to make it very clear that I'm here today to share my thoughts and share in the support of the Board of Historic Preservation and Architectural Review to uphold the village code of our precious village. Currently, the proposed project does not adhere to the Village Code, Chapter 65. In Judge Pastoressa's decision, it is clearly stated that, quote, an historic preservation board is charged with the responsibility of denying a certificate of appropriateness in the reasonable exercise of its powers if the proposal fails to meet the standards of the preservation law, permitted uses of the zoning laws notwithstanding. This decision is very important. Chapter 65 is very clear on what is expected in the historic district. When I worked here in the village of Southampton for 5 years, from 2005 to 2010, I was the Senior Vice President and Executive Director of Eastern Long Island for Brown Harris Stevens Real Estate Firm. I managed over 150 brokers across 7 offices. As all real estate professionals, we took it very seriously to understand the rules of the historic district and that they were different from the other areas of the village. I have no negative feelings toward any of you on the board. Therefore, I want to present in a simple and pragmatic way the issues that the proposed project has and from Chapter 65. Chapter 65(5) states the following. In applying the principles of compatibility, the board shall consider the following feature factors. Point 3, texture, materials, and color, and their relation to similar features of other properties in the neighborhood. Based on the code, there are 2 issues with the proposed project. The clear glass or plexiglass railing is not in keeping and the relation to the similar features of other properties in the neighborhood. The pergola-type shading areas on the decks are also not in keeping and their relation to the similar features of other properties in the neighborhood. Architecturally, they should be covered porches. However, if they were covered porches, this would increase the square footage of the overall house. Both of these details and characteristics can be seen by the public from the beach, which was verified last week. Point 5, the important features of property to be changed to the historical, architectural, cultural, or other significant of such feature of the property or property. Based on the code, there is one main issue with the proposed project, which has still not been resolved, and we talked about it already. My mother made this point. The entire level of the property will be raised approximately 4 feet, according to the plans, which will adversely affect the neighboring properties, such as during storm surge like Hurricane Sandy of 2012. As my mother mentioned, we actually had sandbags that were helping to hold plywood barriers in front of our windows, and they were actually shifted. So the water actually came up and actually shifted those. And as you well know, sandbags are very heavy, and it was obviously a significant amount of water. Point 4, visual compatibility with the surrounding properties, including proportion of the property's front facade, proportion and arrangement of windows, and other openings within the facade, roof shape, and the spacing of properties on streets, including setback. Based on the code, there are 2 issues with the proposed project. The west wall of the project measures 216 feet in length. That is the same distance on Main Street from Home Nature, the store, all the way on the southern wall to the entrance of Brown Harris Stevens. This would include Home Nature, the UBS offices, the Saunders offices, Nest Seekers, Paulette, and part of the BHS entrance. There is no home within the historic district that has such a massing. The roof's slope could be lowered by a foot or 2 on the southern elevation so as not to be so architecturally imposing to the surrounding neighbors. Point 2, the scale of the proposed alteration or new construction and the relation of the property itself, surrounding properties, and the neighborhood. Based on the code, there are 2 issues with the proposed project. The proposed main house is 14,500 square feet. That is 38% larger than the next closest main house of 10,500 square feet. Point 2, the lot coverage has a footprint of 8,547 square feet, which is 113% larger than the fairly average footprint of 4,011 square feet, and is 82% larger than the block average of 4,674 feet. Even Mr. Slifer's historic expert, Mr. Snodgrass, said during the January 25th board meeting that the house is big. I would like the board to know that I did try in April of 2017, that's correct, April of 2017, to meet with Mr. Slifer in person to discuss a resolution. Our phone numbers were shared by a mutual friend. I called Mr. Slifer, he returned my call, and I called him back. Unfortunately, I did not hear back from him after that. I do not hold a grudge, and I do believe that we could have resolved this in 2017. Fortunately, I met with Mr. Slifer for the first time on Sunday, December 16, 2018, for breakfast, where I stated that we would like to be neighbors and we would like to work toward a compromise. I met again with Mr. Slifer on Wednesday, January 9th, for 2 hours with his architect and landscape architect. I met again with Mr. Slifer for 2 hours on Friday, January 25th, with his architect and our architect, Michael Goldblum. We've spoken on the phone approximately 8 times. The board should understand that I will continue to negotiate with Mr. Slifer to resolve this matter. Nevertheless, until we can work out a resolution, I would ask the board to separate out its personal views and stand firm on the supporting the village code, specifically Chapter 65, the details of which I have just presented in as clear a manner as possible. I ask the board to be objective and not subjective. You are on the board to enforce the code. Based on the details I have mentioned, currently the board should not approve this proposed project or application. My 98-year-old father and a village resident since 1960 has stated to me, "It's just too big, it's not in keeping with the neighborhood." However, my sentiments have not changed. I would like to help resolve this with Mr. Slifer, and I would like it to be neighbors. There will be no winners. There will simply be a compromise that neighbors worked out together. As I promised the board on Monday, January 28th, I will continue in good faith to work to a resolution to resolve this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Manger, sorry, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
Because I think maybe all of us, I certainly appreciated your comment back on the meeting on the 28th. I didn't know all of the meetings and conversations you've had.
And can I interrupt for 1 second?
Sure.
We actually had discussed the fact that we would not actually talk about the fact that we'd had meetings.
Okay.
And the contents of those.
Understand.
But it was brought up at the meeting on the 28th, and so I feel it's okay for me now at this point to go ahead and tell you that we have not.
Okay. In those conversations, has there ever been a discussion about the concept of swapping homes on these adjacent parcels?
I've never suggested that. I've never asked that, no.
Okay.
I don't think you could because of the size of the front lot
You could redraw the lot line, though, potentially, right?
You could. That never came up.
Okay.
Does anyone have any other questions? But again, I say to you all, I will continue to negotiate on this in good faith. But I do need, I think, Mr. Haynes, you were at both of those meetings? So
This is not.
I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jeff Bradman for the Objecting Neighbors. I want to deliver to you a petition signed by 183 neighbors and residents who are concerned about the project, and if I can, I'll read it to you, if you don't mind. To the Board of Architectural Review and Historic Preservation regarding the proposed new construction at 28 Gin Lane. We, the undersigned, agree that there is a pending application for nearly a 14,500 square foot house proposed at 28 Gin Lane in the heart of the historic district of Southampton Village. It is greatly out of scale, proportion, and harmony to the neighboring houses. It is obviously incompatible to nearby houses, most of which are under 10,500 feet. In the most recent design, the west wall elevation is approximately 216 feet long from the connected garage on the north to the deck at the south end, about as long as a city block. Its footprint is 113% larger than the fairly average footprint of 4,011 square feet and is 82% larger than the block average of 4,674 square feet. That's the larger Gin Lane block. The proposed addition of extensive fill on the entire property will alter the natural grade, which according to village code is to be avoided in the historic district. As a result, the proposed house will stand out sharply from its surrounding historic structures. It is significantly oversized in mass and bulk and will be starkly visible from Gin Lane and the public parking lot at the southern end of Lake Agawam, as well as the public right-of-way on the beach. We urge the Architectural Review and Historic Preservation Board to deny this application for a certificate of appropriateness. In the alternative, it should require further revisions to 28 Gin Lane to make it more compatible with the surrounding houses and neighborhood as required by Village Code Chapter 65. Mass and scale should be further reduced and the design better tailored to be consistent with the existing historic houses. Please protect and retain the existing integrity of this historic district, the heart of the summer colony. Thank you. And I also, so I'm going to hand this in as a package. And I also have packages of further correspondence from the public. I've got 5 each, 1 each for each board member. Clearly, the public concern is very high and unusual. This is an important case for the village, as well as for the applicant, as well as for the neighbors.
Anyone else from the public?
Good evening. My name is Walter Dean, and I live in the village at number 92 Pierpont Street. My mailing address is Box 4, 11968. Am I to put my photograph on the table for you all?
Facing us. All right, give that back to them.
Before I make my presentation, I did want to say that I had written to you all a letter, and I said in the letter that New York City block fronts were 200 feet. And as I've been walking around New York to take this picture, I realized that not all block fronts are 200 feet. Some are larger, some are smaller. So I just wanted to make that correction for the record. Again, I live in the village. My family came back to the village in the 1960s, However, my ancestors date to Southampton from the early 1700s. The Haven family lived on Shelter Island, on Bridgehampton, in the village of Southampton. In the village, my ancestors lived where the end of Captain's Neck Lane is and where the end of Ox Pasture is, and they were farmers here. I have ancestors that are buried in the town of Southampton, the North Sea burial ground, off of on the way to Shelter Island. So history is very important to me and is one of the reasons that I returned to Southampton. And what we're talking about here tonight is the iconic center of the historical center of Southampton, which in many ways is the iconic center of the American summer community. As Dr. Gallard Thomas built his house as the first purpose summer house in America. So there were many other houses in America that people were there throughout the year, but supposedly when he built that house, it was the first time somebody said, I'll build a house just to stay in the summertime, and then he went back to New York City in the wintertime. And that house, which was on the site of the property that we're discussing tonight, lasted through, I believe, the hurricane of 1938. When you look at pictures of that house, which was at the dead end of where Gin Lane is today, and when I was little and we lived there, it was called Dune Road, but I think it was probably about 50 feet wide or maybe 45 feet wide. What we're talking about tonight, of course, is a house that is maybe 216 feet wide. And when you look at postcards of early Southampton, the iconic view is always from the west going to the east on that stretch of historic Dune Road, now Gin Lane. And when one bikes, walks, jogs, or drives, one has the same perspective as there really was when that road was opened up. And Gin Lane now, Dune Road before, was the first oceanfront road in Southampton, meaning Meadow Lane was added afterwards, and when I was a boy, that was still a dirt road and gravel further to the west. But Meadow Lane is not the original oceanfront road, nor is Gin Lane after South Main Street. So the original road in Southampton along the ocean is just the part that we're talking about tonight that will be completely changed with the perspective of a house that is 216 feet long. So that will be what every person that comes to this beautiful village will see driving on the road is a 216 house, which in effect is really a wall. And Charlie Ayers, who I went to school with, when he built his house a couple of years ago, I'm told, may not be correct, that there were no objections filed from neighbors. And that house I heard referred to before tonight as being large, but I believe it's 100 feet long. That may not be the correct number, but that's what I was told. We're talking about something that's more than twice that long. Also, the Manger house, which is a large house, I believe is 90 feet long. So this is more than twice what the Manger's house is in terms of the width. I live about a mile, I think, Pierpont and Christopher. And from my house, I can see the Dune Church, I can see the Lake Agawam flagpole, and I can see the Presbyterian Church. I think with the massing of this house and the height, and I'm not certain, of course, what the height will be. I heard tonight that the berm would be 4 feet. Maybe it will be less, I don't know. So again, in my letter, I should say I'm not certain what the height will be, but I believe that not only will you be able to see this house on that iconic stretch of road that's been like that for hundreds of years, but you will see it also from other houses, not only in the historic district, but further away, and certainly all of the houses that are on the west side of Lake Agawam. When I was little, I lived in the house that's above Mr. Highsmith, the second house. It's called Normandy House. So the view from Normandy House and from all those houses on the west side of Lake Agawam were basically the same for 150 years, with houses that were of similar size and scale on the other side of the lake. This house will change that perspective forever that's been here since after the Civil War. I brought this perspective just to show you all a block front that's a little bit more than 200 feet, and I'd said in my letter 200 feet. It's a little bit more than 200 feet, but I went around the village today, and I looked at some of our iconic buildings, and I thought I would just put them on top of this plan for you all to see the difference in scale. So the Presbyterian Church, which is, I believe, the first Presbyterian church in America, if you put the church along this block, which is a little bit more than 200 feet, this shows you the Presbyterian church in silhouette with what that house would be in size.
Is that the front of the Presbyterian church?
Correct. The front facade and the tower. Okay. Now, this is approximate. I measured with my feet. I don't know the answer to your question if it was the south or the north. It was from South Main Street.
That's the west elevation.
This is the west, the front elevation, I would call it. The Presbyterian church. I then measured with my feet let me see, the village hall where we are tonight, the front elevation from Main Street.
You don't need to talk into, there are microphones all along.
Okay.
If you would prefer,
My apologies.
easier here.
So the village hall on Main Street, it's about, four tenement houses wide, and then you see the rest of the block front here.
And again, that's the front of the village hall?
Yes, sir, the front facade.
Okay.
Not the north facade.
Not the north facade. The old parish museum, the front facade on Job's Lane. Another iconic Southampton historic building.
How about the east and the west facade?
I didn't have time to do the east and west facade. I apologize. Cinderella. The Cinderella front on Hampton Road.
That's the north facade, right?
I'm sorry, the Cinderella, I don't know if it's the north.
That's the north facade.
To me, it's the front on Hampton Road. The CVS facade. And this is also an approximate with height, not only the length, but the height. And I ran out of poster board, but the only building that I could find that was similar in length is the town hall, which I think is about 200 feet long. It might be longer, I don't know, but if this is 216 feet, the town hall in width from end to end is what is being proposed on the most iconic historic vista in the village of Southampton. And I don't think that our forefathers would have built the old school or the town hall in this location. They chose it to go along Hampton Road, and therefore I don't know why we would consider building a building as wide as the town hall approximately in this particular location. I think the lot is too small and too narrow for a house of this size, and I feel that the house being oriented north and south, blocking that vista, is not the appropriate orientation. It should have been oriented east and west, but obviously there's not the size to do that. So therefore I urge that the design of the house be changed so that it's more in keeping with the historic area. It's more in keeping with our ancestors' views of this very special center of Southampton. And I would love to welcome the family that is building this house to the neighborhood when hopefully they'll consider changing the house so that it's more in keeping with the neighborhood. And I thank you very much. Would you like this plan?
No, we have enough pieces of paper. Thank you.
Great, Board. Thank you. My name is John Pine, and I'd like to submit two letters, one written by my wife, Ann, and one written by myself, which I'd just like to read.
John, can you state your address for the record?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just doing that right here. My wife, Ann, and I have been long-term advocates of preserving the historic district of Southampton Village. We live in a Victorian-style house at 449 Hill Street, and the property has a barn. We think that the house and barn date from the late 1800s, when the property was a farm owned by the Howell family and stretched from Hill Street to the Long Island Railroad tracks to the north. The historic district has certain requirements of mass and scale, which, in my opinion, developers have tried to circumvent in the last 10 years. The current application at 28 Gin Lane again makes a mockery, in my opinion, of the historic district standards as to mass and scale. It is a 14,500 square foot house in the heart of the historic district, which is incompatible to nearby houses, most of which are under 10,500 square feet. The scale, proportion, and harmony suggest visions of grandeur. Our summer cottages are grand, but even this design surpasses any normal need for a family house. Let's be realistic. I attended one meeting of the ARB last year where this project was discussed. The architect made many references to Edward Lutyens, the famous British architect who created many distinct country houses in England and in Scotland. He suggested that this house integrated many of the famous thematic design schemes that Lutyens used, such as the gatehouse at Salutation in Sandwich, England, and Folly Farm, among others. Lutyens also designed many public buildings in India on a massive scale. I've stayed at the Salutation and Grey Walls, another Lutyens design inspired in Scotland. Based on the effects of the Lutyens design at these houses/inns, I can attest that they bear nothing to the design put forward by this architect for 28 Gin Lane. The design reminds me, however, of the idea of a Lutyens-designed presidential residence in New Delhi, India. We do not need presidential residences in the heart of the Southampton Village. In closing, I ask the board to protect and retain the existing integrity of the historic district, the heart of the summer colony. I am bringing a copy of the recent residence section of the Southampton Press, dated February 21, 2019, to illustrate the folly of grand designs. Thank you. Just in case you didn't catch that, this house may be raised, according to this article. And I'll give that to you, too. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Ellen Scarborough. This is a letter my husband Chuck and I wrote to you, the board. Dear board members, pending application for a nearly 14,500 square foot house proposed at 28 Gin Lane in the historic district of Southampton Village is greatly out of scale, proportion, and harmony with the neighboring houses. It is obviously incompatible with nearby houses, most of which are under 10,000 square feet. In the most recent design, the west-facing wall is over 200 feet, as we all have heard. The ridge of the roof line is 52 feet in height, producing a massive and intimidating design. The proposed house will stand out sharply from the surrounding historic structures. It is significantly oversized and will be starkly visible from Gin Lane and the public parking lot at the south end of Lake Agawam. We urge the Board of Architectural Review and Historic Preservation to deny this application for a certificate of appropriateness. In the alternative, it should require further revisions for 28 Gin Lane to make it more compatible with the surrounding houses and the neighborhood as required by the Village Code, Chapter 65. Mass and scale should be further reduced and the design better tailored to be consistent with the existing historic houses. Please protect the integrity of our historic district. Thank you.
Is that it?
That's all that we have. I don't know, there may be other people who want to
Is there anyone else who would like to speak? So, Mr. Bennett. Oh, wait. What? Wait.
My name is Diane Deutschman, 200 Lewis Street, Southampton, New York. I have been a village resident for 80 years. I am a former member of the ARB, and I am appalled by the current plan. In the most recent design, the west wall elevation is approximately 216 feet long from the connected garage on the north to the deck at the south end, and about as long as a city block. Its footprint is 113% larger than the fairly average footprint of 4,011 square feet, and it is 82% larger than the block average of 4,674 square feet. The proposed addition of extensive fill on the entire property will alter the natural grade, which, according to the village code, is to be avoided in the historic district. As a result, the proposed house will stand out sharply from the surrounding historic structures. It is significantly oversized in mass and bulk and will be starkly visible from Gin Lane and the public parking lot at the southern end of Lake Agawam, as well as the public right-of-way onto the beach. I urge the Architectural Review and Historic Board to reject this application for a certificate of appropriateness. In the alternative, it should require further revisions for 28 Gin Lane to make it more compatible with the surrounding houses and the neighborhood as required by Village Code, Chapter 65. I think that's very important. When I was on the board, we spent so much time on Village Code, Chapter 65, to make sure that the mass and scale should be further reduced and design better tailored to be consistent with the existing historic houses. The applicant can get what he wants with a better design without destroying the harmony of the historic district. Please protect and retain the existing integrity of this historic district, the heart of this summer colony. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Bennett?
This application was filed in November 2018. A public hearing was held on December 10th, 2018. At that time, the opposition requested time to respond. The meeting was adjourned. Okay. The meeting was adjourned not for 2 weeks or a month, but for 7 weeks. The next meeting was held on January 28th. At that time, the opposition was not prepared to move forward with their presentation. The meeting was thereafter adjourned until February 11th. The opposition did not present all of their expert testimony, claiming it was due to being too late in the hour. This is now the 4th public hearing on this application. After the last meeting, we requested a copy of the opposition reports to respond to them in writing. We were provided only with copies of Mr. Goldblum's report on Tuesday, February 19th, although we were supposed to get them on February 15th. Nevertheless, we did respond to Mr. Goldblum's February 19th correspondence in writing. This is all we need to do. Since the last meeting, we've made only 2 submissions, one which is a view shed from the ocean, which everyone's had the opportunity to see. And then we also filed a letter from our office and correspondence from Mr. Snodgrass, both of which Mr. Goldblum and Ms. Burkett have responded to this evening. So Mr. Goldblum has spoken and responded to our written submissions. Ms. Burkett has spoken and responded to our written submissions. Ms. Couts, pardon me if I mispronounced your name, has spoken. Mr. Schneider spoken. All he did was talk about his letter that's now 2 years old. Mr. Bragman has spoken. Mrs. Manger has spoken probably for the 6th or 7th time. Charles Manger spoke. Mr. Dean has spoken. Mr. Pine spoke. Ms. Scarborough has spoken. And former board member has spoken. At this time, I would ask that the matter be closed only for written submissions. I have, and that can be from either side without limitation. The only thing I would ask, I did not get a copy of Ms. Burkett's submission. I'd like her, since she has it in writing, I'd like that to be filed within the next, by Wednesday, Thursday at the latest. I would respectfully request that the board close the matter for written submissions until giving everyone 2 weeks. That's everyone. And what I mean by that is I will respond. I don't need time to respond further to anything that the opposition would like to put into. I don't want to have, as is typical in the law, an opportunity to further respond, which is typically what's given the applicant. We should close the meeting, give it 2 weeks for written submission, and that's it.
I would like, okay.
I don't think you're going to need to.
This is discussion of the board.
Jeff, no, please.
So much leeway.
Please, Jeff.
On the written submissions, I
Who's
just want
running
to...
this? Please.
One more week.
Please, we're not even discussing that
close
yet.
this.
You'll have a chance. Please, just hear me out, please. I heard what John was asking for. There's been a lot of public statements and testimony to be considered. I'd like us as a board here in front of the public to share with them some of our thinking now, okay? And I'm not ready nor willing to close it to public discussion, at least right at this moment. I'm not saying that at the end of the meeting we may not do that, but I'd like to hear from the board their response to the community and the number of people that John has cited in speaking and what their thinking is now. Because there may be some comments, there may be questions coming out of that would require us to go beyond written submission. I don't know, one way or the other, but
I'm not prepared to
hear
close the meeting for written submission.
Okay, so can we hear
Personally, this is a lot of material. There's been a lot said. And I have still questions about the fill issue, which seems to be the most mysterious part. I can
respond to that with absolute clarity. It's an absolute straw. Please don't laugh. It's a straw argument. I'll tell you why. First of all, the height of the building is taken from the base floodplain elevation plus 2 feet of freeboard. That's clear. There's no question about it. Not only that, there is a SWIP that's been filed, which has been filed and approved. A SWIP is a plan to take care of all the drainage. That's been filed, that's been approved. It was sent to the Department of Environmental Conservation. It was approved by the building department. It was never challenged. The wall was built pursuant to a building permit. I feel like I've had to repeat this ad nauseum. The wall was... You've heard it all. The wall was built pursuant to a building permit, which was never challenged. It was never challenged. Not only that, the code, when the village trustees amended the code to allow greater heights in or elevated buildings in area of flood issues, what they did was they said that in the case of an elevated building, the terms and conditions of a building permit for such elevated building may require the elevation of natural grade to be increased for the purposes of minimizing any adverse impact on the neighborhood. Why did they do that? Because, and this was all in the public testimony, because they did not want what happens in West Hampton Beach and in the town of Southampton, where you have elevated buildings with the pilings visible. So that is a policy of the village of Southampton. This fill, by the way, I find it hard to believe that in terms of relatively speaking, you have to remember that this house is 52 feet above sea level. 52 feet above sea level. The Michael Check house is 63 feet above sea level. The Manger house is 61 feet above sea level. And the grades are higher. So you have, and you don't have to take my word for it, you have an approved SWIP, sent to the Department of Environmental Conservation, no comments, approved by the building department, never attacked. You have a wall that was subject to a building permit, never attacked. It's there, it's legal. The planning board looked at this, found no issue with it.
But, excuse me, did they look at it recently? Or
Yes, the planning board looked at and approved this plan.
In this
Yes,
hearing?
absolutely.
Okay.
So that's a pure red herring, and it's beyond attack, even assuming for the purposes of argument that it's within your jurisdiction.
But why is it being raised? Is it being raised?
Because they are throwing anything that they can at this application.
Asking you a question.
I just responded.
Why is it being raised across the entire length is it across the length of the property? Could you, someone just, let's hear the numbers
Bailey
here.
Larkin, Bennett and Reed.
Thank you.
We have in our building department record an approved SWIP that has a grading plan that shows the grade that is across this property. This plan also went to the planning board for landscape review when the original application was approved. The house landscape plan has not changed since that time. The planning board was requested to also look at grading and drainage, and one of the comments that was actually made by Nelson Pope and Voorhees was that all of the existing hedging along that eastern side of the property where Fairleigh is will remain where it currently is. So there is not going to be 4 feet of fill piled against that hedgerow. We can submit in writing for the record a copy of the SWIP, the grading plan that is part of that application, and also the planning board's comments from Nelson Pope and Voorhees that explain the grading and drainage on this property. I don't have copies this evening, but it's something we can file it in writing for you.
So the grading, so this is my thing. I get it that, you know, perhaps because of the septic and because of the FEMA rules, among other things, that you have to put some fill in, perhaps, but do you have to cover, so I still don't get how much, because I believe actually that what I consider adding 4 feet of fill across an entire area, I'm not saying you're doing that, you'll have to tell me, suburbanizes this even more, which is like what people don't want.
Excuse me, comments, one at a time.
It would be an insane thing to do.
You need to identify yourself.
Edmund Hollander, landscape architect.
Yeah, maybe you can straighten this out, Mr. Hollander.
The best thing we should do, and the board should have a copy of the plan that was filed and approved. Because everyone's talking about this, and it's a fiction. It's like I'm sitting here listening to this. There's an approved plan that we filed that shows every grade and elevation. It's been approved by everybody. It's been approved by the state, by the village. We just completed a dune restoration there where we have...
I saw that.
Where we've completed that. That was approved by the village and the state. Everything we've done, we've tried to do to benefit our client and everybody around us. But I've listened to more fiction tonight than I've been reading in a good book. There are filed plans that show every detail of this. We could just look at it together.
Can you answer a plain English question?
I can try.
Is there anything that you know, to address a concern I think Mrs. Manger brought up, is there anything you know about the fill and the new grading that would cause water on that property, either coming in from the ocean or elsewhere, to go onto neighboring properties?
100% not, because it's not legal to do that. We are required by code to pick up all storm water on our own property. And the plans that were filed and approved show that. Sorry, that's all.
It's just,
I mean, that's it. I apologize.
how can we reassure these neighbors who...
I'm happy to sit with anybody and take out, we could sit with you if we have the approved plan here. It shows that in black and white on a plan. I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to get into a fight with the guy that said I did this, I did that. I don't know what I said.
Well, how about if they should probably show it on the record. I mean, we're sitting here.
You could submit it.
It's our job.
That's our file. Right.
Yes.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
The reason there was no objection to the wall is because it went through the building department, and they claimed it didn't require any notification. The first we knew of the wall was when we watched it being built, which was the end of December in 2016. We had not heard anything about any wall being constructed, which is why we never responded. I just want that clear. We did not ignore it. We did not know about it. My second question is, I've been asking for 2 years.
What was your first question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, my first question, please. My second comment is we've asked for 2 years to have an explanation of the plan that I showed you that shows the grading of the earth going nowhere. No one has answered that to me. I've asked the question, and perhaps I could get an answer. I sat through the entire planning board hearing, and I asked the question again. I was told that there would not be any problem, but having someone tell me that there will not be any problem and actually seeing a drawing or something specific to me is not the same thing. I would also like to mention that I do have a copy of the SWIFT plan, whatever you call this. And in it, it says that the earth will be returned to its natural grade at the property lines. That is not shown on the plan. So therefore, that is why I'm still questioning it. No one has supplied me with any grading plans or shown me what happens to this 4 feet of fill, which in fact does not have to be, it can be around the house. It doesn't have to be the entire property.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at.
I understand.
That's what the SWIFT plan shows.
Right,
There's no
that's what
mystery.
I'm trying to get to.
Show that.
One at a time, please.
It's been filed in the building department's
So,
office for 2 years.
I'm
sorry.
if I may say, so I appreciate the fact that there are things that are filed, but inasmuch as there is an element of mystery, because well, John, from a technical standpoint, there's no mystery in the sense that things have been revealed, but they haven't been revealed to the people who need to see them most. John, please let me speak. John, please, John.
He referred to the septic
John, please let me speak, okay? All right? Thank you, John. So the point is that we're having a public debate here. We have a neighbor who said that they've had a dialogue. You've had the principal neighbor saying that there's a gap of understanding. So for the sake of a little bit of further discussion, I think Ed can explain it well. All I'm saying, and that's another reason why we should not close the meeting for written decision now, is to allow the objectants and the applicant to resolve this, not to compromise on it, but it seems that...
They can do it in writing.
Please.
Well, you know, sometimes doing things in writing have gotten us to this point, John, where you say there's no mystery, your applicant says they've done everything to accommodate the neighbors, and then I find out that they're not even talking that much until Mr. Manger had just revealed, yes, 2 sessions ago. But in any event, the talking, there can be explanation. It's not asking that
No,
much.
no.
Okay, so then it'll prolong the meeting. John, if you want to prolong this...
No, I want you to do your job
Oh, thank you
and
very
close
much.
this hearing.
Excuse
I would
me.
just like to add that I would also...
We'll both do our jobs.
...to do your job. And please, somebody explain to me what happens to this
So
fiddle.
maybe we could have it explained at the next meeting.
Thank
Well,
you.
if I may,
I will come
Mrs.
out to the
Manger,
next meeting.
Mrs. Manger, you do have an engineer on your retainer, Mr. Schneider, correct?
Yes.
And he did submit tonight, he was talking about this wall and the fill being placed.
Right.
Could he review for you and explain the SWIP plan? That's a
Well,
matter of record?
I have read it.
You have a copy?
I have a copy, and I've
Right.
read it.
But maybe I'd suggest you talk to your engineer, and then if he has further questions, he could present those to the board.
Okay.
That is perhaps true, as
That's a
long
good
as
format.
someone explains to me why the plan shows the earth going nowhere and I have a copy of the SWIFT plan.
You're talking about the architectural.
Right, it's an architectural.
Okay, but not the SWIP plan.
No, and the SWIFT plan says that the dirt is returned to its natural grade. So therefore, they're not consistent with each other. And that
Okay,
is
so you
what
pointed that out, that the architectural plans are not consistent with the SWIP plan. That would be good, though, for your engineer maybe to explain the SWIP plan, so to understand what the grading
I
is.
can understand the SWIFT plan.
Okay, so,
Well, the SWIP plan, if I may, controls. The SWIP plan controls. It's just a mere architectural drawing. It's not meant to be a grading plan. And that controls. They've given a permit, and if I don't build according to the SWIP plan, I'm in violation of the state law and the village code.
John, in all fairness, your architectural plans should be consistent with your SWIP
We
plan.
can do that in writing. We'll modify it, absolutely.
Okay, one of you.
So the purpose of your public hearing is, first of all, is to gather information and aid you in making the decision. So the question of closing the hearing is whether or not you have the information to aid you in making a determination, and whether or not further public testimony is going to provide you with any further information in aiding you to do that. One of the things that has been here is a lot of written submissions, which I think are very helpful. We've been here for over almost 3 hours.
No kidding.
I'm sure you don't remember the first person's testimony, and having all this in writing, I think, is very important. So at some point, regardless of any further verbal testimony, I think all the professionals have submitted reports. It would be well worth it to have those in writing for your review and consideration. As far as Mr. Broadleaf, you indicated you like to raise questions and have a discussion with the board. That's part of your deliberation. That comes after the close of the hearing. Once you have the hearing closed, if you want to deliberate and discuss and have questions with the board members over that information that was submitted, that is something you do as a board after the close of the public hearing.
Here's the problem we have with that, Wayne, is that by closing it to written comment usually stifles discussion among the board, because then in past, and maybe this is not your interpretation of the law, but our counsel who usually sits in that seat says you can't discuss anything in more than one person at a time for fear that you are having a meeting which has to be discussed in public. The end result of that is that discussion is stifled. I'm happy to share my thoughts with the board now. I'm happy to deliberate with the board now.
You haven't closed the hearing yet.
Close the hearing first.
Well, then Susan normally asks for comments from the board.
That's fine, as long as it's not a deliberation on the decision, because you haven't heard the entire
All right,
record.
so
hasn't
we're
been
being
closed.
a little bit semantical, and it's maybe the difference between you going to law school and me going to business school, and I accept that.
Well, I'm here to help you and guide you in abiding by the law, but the purpose of the public hearing is to get information that will help you in deciding the matter.
And we normally have in our meetings a chance where the board says, is there any comment from the board? And if she chooses to do that, or questions or whatever. I'm not looking to necessarily deliberate with the board. I can do that one-on-one.
Had questions at 3 meetings. We answered them. We've been here for 4 meetings. Let's just be honest. You want to prolong this as well?
Mr. Bennett, you're not helping.
You did mention deliberation, I think, and that's what the specifics of your saying
I take
deliberation.
that back.
You can question each other with the board, but if you're going to make commentary over your decision over this application, council is saying you have to wait until we close the meeting.
Close the hearing.
Close the hearing, I'm sorry, close the hearing.
So then...
And I think he's saying that after the hearing is closed, we can still, in the next public hearing, discuss it, deliberate.
You did on the one for 24. You did it. You deliberated on 24. You did it yourself. You proved your own point.
Mr. Bennett.
I would again ask that you close the meeting for written submission.
And also, if the application is closed for written commentary as well as written decision, at any point in time where information or additional information has been dispersed and board members feel that they need additional information, we can always reopen the application after the fact.
Thank you. If the board is willing to deliberate at the next hearing, after we've had a chance to read this information, then I'm okay with that.
You're saying discuss or deliberate?
Deliberate.
I'd like to discuss now, if you want.
If the
Okay.
hearing
Would you have something to say, please?
Right, but in the, again, in the past, and I can think of one case in particular, we got at loggerheads where we couldn't talk, not loggerheads among the board, but between council and the board about what we could discuss, and it ended up that we ended up not talking. Now, whether that would have changed our decisions one way or the other, I just want us as a board to be able to communicate, and if we do that at the next session, based on the material that's been submitted, like we did with 24 tonight, I'm okay with that. I just want to make sure that we truly discuss, deliberate, and if it has to be held in a public venue,
It does.
then that's fine.
That's my job, partially.
And if that means that the public can't comment, they'll see us deliberate, and I'm okay with that too. The only issue that I have that would preclude me from closing it tonight is, and I know, John, you laid out very nicely, and Ed, you did as well, in terms of the issues, but I'm still a little bit unclear as to the fill issue, whether that can be resolved among the professionals or between the professionals on both sides.
Inspector explain it to you guys? Maybe
I've
that
talked
way
to the building inspector yesterday.
I won't say anything else.
Ed, and what I'm saying, yes, I did query the building inspector, and after hearing your side, the Mangers and the Bragmans and everybody else, I'm still a little bit confused. And again, your indulgence for clearing that up, and whether that has to be done by written submission, okay. I'm not necessarily concerned one way or the other, but I don't feel that I'm in a position to vote on this unless I feel comfortable understanding that fully. And again, resolving that issue as well as having the opportunity to deliberate and discuss among my fellow board members, as long as we can do that, I'm okay with...
Totally in favor of that.
Well, Jeff, if I may just interrupt, I just want to say, so the issue of the fill is it's purely a technical, legal issue for professionals. And I don't think any topics from the general public are going to aid you in that. That's not to say that Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bragman, or any of the engineers, or the building inspector, or your council can't weigh in and within any written comment. But I don't know if the general public is going to aid you in deciding what fill and how that applies or doesn't apply to your code.
But we actually...
That aspect
let me just finish. I agree with and accept Wayne's conclusion. I take a slight issue with whether the purview of this board does or does not extend to landscaping, because in my view it does. And if the fill, whatever the technical need from which it arose might be, if it in fact alters the property, then it does come under this board in terms of we see landscape design. So I would just like some clarification of that. And I don't think it's a significant point of argument. There's a technical side, and then there's the aesthetic side.
Can I make a comment, please?
I don't know. It's up at this point, Wayne.
Well, I mean, your prerogative of it's a public hearing now, and you haven't closed it or otherwise. If you're going to continue hearing everybody, then you can continue. But this is the point of deliberation: is as soon as you open your mouth, somebody wants to speak about it.
Right.
So if you're going to deliberate and ask those questions,
I do think we're getting to
certainly
an end,
you want at some point you have to close the hearing, because there's not going to be any further information that's going to aid you in deciding this. You have to go back and review it and decide it.
And I appreciate your position as well, but just so my fellow board members know and the public knows, is I would err on the side of the community and the public. And if I open my mouth and say a question arises from somebody else, so be it. It's a public hearing.
May I make a comment?
That's up to the chair.
Yes.
What's confused us about the fill is that we've gotten contradictory explanations about why they're putting the fill in. Tonight, they're implying that they're doing it because of FEMA, the flood elevation requirements that the first floor be elevated. Can I speak without being interrupted, please?
Mr. Bragman, it was made very clear it was not for FEMA because FEMA doesn't provide for fill, but it was the village policy that they don't want to see
I heard that, but I
houses
also
on
heard
piles
John
and they
Bennett.
want to use fill for aesthetic purposes.
He indicated and gave an explanation of the FEMA elevation requirement, and I just want to make it clear that FEMA does not require the placement of fill, regardless of what the village policy...
That's what I just said, Jeff.
Regardless of what the village policy has to say. In previous encounters on this issue, we were told that they had to put the fill in because they needed it for the septic system. That's why we brought an engineer in to say you don't need to put fill in for the septic system. The idea that you can have a serious issue like this is a proposal to elevate from 2 to 4 feet a property in the heart of the historic district. The idea that you can close the record before you know the technical details of it.
You do.
And that's okay. And that's okay. And that we can't see what the ultimate submission is and talk about it in public is frankly absurd. I mean, you're not ready to deliberate until all the substantive issues are out in the record, in front of the public, in a public hearing where we can comment or at least hear you comment. And the other thing I want to add as a board member myself is there is nothing wrong with you discussing this application without closing the record. There's no rule that says...
I agree with that.
That's an absurdity. This is a democracy.
I agree.
And we hold public hearings so that evidence comes in a context where the public can see it and hear it, even if you don't allow comment. So my request, and the last point is that this is not a technical legal issue over which you have no power. As we have argued in this case, and what brought us back to your board was that we got a ruling from a court that said that historic review is in addition and over the power of the village to zone. And that rule applies in the question of whether you should permit fill on this site. It's not a technical legal issue, it's a historic preservation issue. And the prevention of modifying landscapes is mentioned in several locations in your design guidelines. It is within your power. It's not a technical legal issue that some engineer is going to decide for you. You have to decide it under the historic guidelines, and that's what we want. And we want to hear any of this evidence that comes in, even if you don't take comment. We want to hear it in public. There may be members of the public that want to hear it. So I would say, keep the record.
He'll go on all night. Can I have a vote?
No, Mr. Bennett, you're not running the meeting. I'm sorry.
I'm asking.
I have the unfortunate...
I wonder if I can ever get through a comment without Mr. Bennett
All right, well, let's...
throwing a temper tantrum. Okay, so all I'm saying is that if there is a substantive historic preservation issue, it's for you to decide. My recommendation at this point is keep the record open so we can hear what the facts are. And then we can close it for
I'm not
written
saying
comment.
close the meeting. I'm saying close it for written submission only.
I don't think that's appropriate with an issue like
Because
this.
he wants to drag it on.
Unresolved. This case has been dragged on for approximately 1 month.
Gentlemen.
30 days.
That's it. Everyone, please.
Jeff had some comments, I think. I mean,
No, what I think, yes, I have comments that would be part of a discussion, and it's not going to behoove us tonight because we have so much volume of submissions. I'd like you, Christina, and everybody else to look at this and take it all in, and then as long as we can have public deliberations, then I'm okay with that. And in my view, the fill is part of that, the design is part of that, the scale is part of that, but we've got a ton of stuff here, to Wayne's point, that we can digest as long as we don't stifle our discussion and the public can be a part of that.
Well, they can't if we close it.
No, but if they will be a part of it, please, in the sense that they can witness our discussion. It's an open meeting. And
well, if we close it for written submission and then no one can talk except us.
They can write their
supposed to
comments.
deliberate in
They can
public.
write their comments.
That's the point. You're
We
supposed
have to deliberate in public,
Well,
I'm not
so the
saying that,
question-
but
the
the question is the
Right,
interaction.
so
They
the
can write their
question,
comments to the
so the
board.
question is what Wayne had posed before. Do you think that we have received ample input from the applicant and from the public to absorb all of that and then have a discussion among ourselves to make a decision? If you don't feel
No, that's not
that...
quite accurate, Jeff. I said for written submission
I'm
only.
sorry, right.
So that you
Okay.
Be honest now.
John, I'm honest. I may not be technically, again...
I should say.
Thank you, John. We got it. He's correct.
All right,
Again,
please, everyone sit
I'm not a
down.
JD, I'm
We're,
a lowly MBA.
we're having a,
All right,
we're at the
so,
point of discussing
I think
whether...
I've said the same thing about a half dozen times.
All right,
Curtis,
so
are you
I
keeping
am
count?
personally, I don't function as well with the closed for written submissions as most people, but I'm willing to go along with whatever the board chooses.
A vote.
At some point, can I make a comment?
Yes,
Okay, I just want to
that's
make
what
sure.
we're here for.
Just want
Go
to make sure at
Curtis.
some point I don't
Please
interrupt anyone.
comment.
With all due respect to the process, I think we received a ton of information on a series of this application process from both the applicant as well as the opponents to the application. I want to be able to have conversation without any outside interruption. For us to be able to dialogue with one another, if there are things you want to say publicly, things you want to bring notice of, I want to be able to do that without the involvement from other people. So I prefer it to be a closed for written comment and written decision. And that way, if we want to discuss things at our next meeting, we can either at the next meeting make those comments, or at the next meeting make a vote to empower our council to do a written decision. But more information, I think we've reached our limit of information at this point. I don't think there's anything further that can be added to the file, which of substance that would make anything different or improve on the application. I think it's complete. And I think that's part of the responsibility of this process, to receive a complete application. I think we've done that. Now allow us the opportunity for us to have conversation, discussion, and uninterrupted publicly. And if the next meeting we decide, hey, we've reached our limit, then make the vote for council to prepare for a written decision. Is that?
Just as further, if you get in that discussion, you always have the right to reopen.
Correct.
Right. We can reopen.
So with that provision, yes. With that provision, because if you make some comments that I would like to then respond to?
No, that
You could put them in writing. It's for written comment and written decision.
Or you could reopen the hearing. I mean,
Or we could
I'm
reopen
still,
the
I'm still concerned about the fill, so I would
Right.
like to hear your
We need to
discussion.
have
And I would
information.
like to know that. But at the end of that, I may still have questions that I would like to have answered.
And you can submit those questions into the board as part of the written comments. Not necessarily. That's.
Why can't I just ask at the end of
Because
your
there
deliberation?
would be no
And that's part of the
verbal.
issue, the concern that I have personally, is that we're getting a bunch of information verbally, then it gets attacked, and it gets rebutted, and
No.
we received a lot of...
You wouldn't even have to answer me. I would just like to be able to pose my questions to you.
Well, you would have to read the file and then write a question, which would be legal if we closed the meeting for written comment.
Please, this is not.
So the point is, if you close the hearing tonight, subject to a written comment period, anybody can provide whatever questions, comments,
Right, I
or
hear you.
otherwise in writing to be submitted to the board. And you can duly consider that. And if after your due deliberation and consideration, you decide that you need
Folks, are you
further
listening to
information.
Wayne because he's sharing some information that I think is helpful?
Yeah. So whether it's tonight or any further hearing of this board, if you decide to close the hearing, that means no further comment unless the board keeps it open for written comment, in which case it's been the practice of this board to accept written comments from all parties on any matter relevant to the application, whether they be questions, comments, or otherwise. The board would review that as part of the record, and they will consider that in their deliberations. Any point during your deliberations, if you have further questions, particularly of the applicant as to the project, or you need further information, you have the right to reopen the hearing at that point and solicit that information, whether it be in writing or by testimony. If you have no further questions and you feel, as has been indicated, that you have enough information to proceed and make a decision on this matter, then you could continue in your deliberations and at some point advise your council to prepare a resolution based on your deliberations. At some point, you have to get to a point where you believe you have enough information and you have to make a decision.
Right.
Both parties are urging the board to make a certain decision. It's clear. Everybody's requested that. A certain decision that goes one way or another, both parties. The point is that we're now, in my opinion, starting to hear repeats of the information. And the question is a new continuation of the verbal testimony going to give you further information that's going to supplement this record that you have, which included many hearings before, as well as these hearings, and many documents. So it's a substantial record.
Someone has to make a motion.
I actually have some questions for Mr. Goldblum. Is this an appropriate time for those?
Before we close, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
because he's not going to show.
Because you're here.
Talk,
We appreciate
he's not coming.
Okay. I have a couple general questions. In your written submission, you went over this in our last hearing, I think.
Robert, just for the record, what submission is that?
This is a February 18th memorandum on 24 Gin Lane / 28 Gin Lane from Michael Goldblum. And I think it generally summarizes, not verbatim, but closely, your comments in the last hearing. So you say that the proposal for 28 Gin Lane is 93% larger than the Fairleigh average, and 63% larger than the block average, I believe. And just for the record, I think that Ms. Burkett misquoted some of those figures tonight.
Possibly. I wasn't checking.
You had said 75% larger than Fairleigh, but I think this is correct. I think it's 93% larger. And before I get to the question, I'll just comment that if it's 93% larger than Fairleigh and 63% larger than the block average, it's also then 40% larger than the average of the non-Fairleigh homes, the 12 non-Fairleigh homes that you had. You don't have to take my word for it,
makes sense.
but roughly.
Makes sense-ish.
So because I went and looked at all those houses. I've looked at them as much as I can from the street and from the beach. Not all of them are visible from the beach, but and I started thinking about the house-to-house comparisons within that block. And first thing I think the data shows, there are 3 houses in the larger block anyway that are larger than 14,500. But I was thinking about all the different comparisons in there. And I come to a total of 190 possible home-to-home comparisons. I could show you the math, but if you would trust me, that there are 190 different home-to-home comparisons. If you take the most favorable for the applicant view, that the standard is 40% or more larger, it turns out that 136 of those comparisons show one house being 40% or more larger than the other. So 72% of those home-to-home comparisons show a house that is 40% or more larger than another. But even if you take the 93%, you actually get 79 homes. 42% of those home-to-home comparisons show a difference of 93% or more. And I'm just struggling with, I guess I'm wondering, if you as an architect saw a characteristic occur in a neighborhood between 40% and almost 3/4 of the time, would you consider that atypical? I'm struggling with why it's atypical, because averages can deceive. And you're the one who's also told us we should be looking at the actual visual context. And I'm just wondering if...
Let me think about that for a second.
Okay.
Well, wait a second. How many, where are you getting all these houses from?
It's the 20 houses that Mr. Goldblum put together.
Basically, let me see if I understand what you're saying by rephrasing it.
Sure.
What you're saying is that that one of the characteristics of the block is a variation from house to house.
Correct. Pretty significant.
Right.
And pretty widely spread.
that if the frequency of that and magnitude of that variation is relatively consistent, why isn't this consistent with that pattern?
I'm just wondering what is so atypical about this house in that context?
Well, I think that...
Just from a comparative size standpoint.
I think that, I guess I'd have to really think about that a little bit more than standing here on one foot to answer you in a reactive way.
If you want to...
But I guess I go back to why I am not a numbers person. and this is, as I'm sure Mr. Bennett will attest,
No,
I'm an architect. I draw, and I came to the numbers here as a way to try to present my impressions in a way that I could back up and say, oh, he says this, they said that. How do I decide? So I tried to understand it, and I maybe fell into the rabbit hole of the numbers. But I think that for me, what emerged from the process ratified my visceral sense that the house seemed large and crowded to the sight and disoriented. And when I started to look at the numbers, some of the numbers were shocking. Some of them were, okay, this is a big house, we could tell that, but it was not less, it was for me less the raw numbers than the relationships that those numbers seemed to ratify. And that has to do with the issue of the proximity combined with the size and scale, or the footprint. So it wasn't just one or the other in isolation, because you're right, this house isn't the biggest house on the block. And this is a block with great variation on it. But it's the size plus the proximity plus the orientation plus its extensiveness that together seem to make it, I was trying to explain for myself why it just felt wrong. And I think that I came to it by looking at it in a numerical way, and if that may not have been the best way, but it was the way I did it. And I hate to have the discussion get bogged down in the numbers, because really it's not about them. I'm sure that many of the numbers, from the GIS are not accurate. They're what I had. But I think to the extent that they ratified something that I perceived architecturally, experientially, what I saw from the plans, that's the degree to which I attributed to its significance. Now, I think that your point is valid, but I think that relational matrix disregards the local clustering of those numbers, and that has to do with more of the siting thing and the placement of the house at the zone between Fairleigh and the western portion of the block. So I think that's really more of, I think if this house was happening several lots to the east on one of those large through lots, I think it would be a much harder argument to argue that it's inappropriate, because it's amidst houses of its similar scale. It seems to work better. And I think just like a quick scan of the block plan tells that. There's a rhythm to it.
On your comments about the western facade, I think in relation to that, you state that the shingle style always relieves extensive facades with three-dimensional modulations.
Often. Usually.
Okay. You did say always.
Hyperbole, pardon me.
Okay.
I'm sure
because I was going to ask you about
not
only 88 Gin Lane, which I believe is shingle style, but also the William Lowe house that we saw tonight. Those are both shingle style houses without much modulation. Should we not consider those?
I think that the Lowe house is a very unusual house in the shingle style. I think it's certainly one of the landmark buildings, as identified by Scully. And it certainly speaks to the roofscape arguments that Misha was talking about. But it is
not, every house is different, and I think that that one doesn't show a lot of relief. It does have some. It does have some deep-in porches and the bay windows, but it is relatively flat, and I think that in that case, the architect was purposefully making it very flat, perhaps to distinguish it from others. I mean, the same architect was the one who I was citing in one of my images, Stanford White.
These photos you gave us tonight.
Right.
On pages 3 through 6, I'm seeing this
Right.
view.
Right, the view from looking west.
Right.
Yeah.
On page 5 is this view.
Right.
And we heard some other folks mention comments about views from other private homes. Does this board have, in your opinion, or to your knowledge, have purview over
Well, I guess when I looked at...
Let me finish my question, please.
Sure, I'm sorry.
Purview over disruptions to views from private homes.
Well, why is that a question you should be asking him?
I guess I can answer it from my point of view.
Jeff,
I can't answer it.
He put pictures in the record that he's asking us to consider, so I'd
can
like to know how much he thinks we should consider.
Yeah, but
That's the question.
Well, look,
Okay,
I will say to you honestly from 2 points. I'll answer that question to the extent that I can. First, I'll say that, as I introduced it, I did not produce them. I did not choose the views. Mr. Stott did. When I looked at them, their relevance to me was related less to the view from the Mangers and more of the view from Fairleigh, the street, across their property to the houses, which I think would be within your purview, since Fairleigh is a public way. It's a private road, but could you walk down it today?
No.
It's got a gate and lock.
Wayne, this is an important legal question.
My
Is
understanding
Fairleigh
is
a
that
public
you're allowed
way?
to walk down it.
As far as I know, it's a private road.
You're actually not allowed to
Okay,
walk down.
then
You could, and no one would
Then that
probably
would-
come and get you.
Okay.
But
Because I did, and I didn't. No one arrested me.
if they're friendly.
I have one final question, if I could.
I can't answer that, but I think that I would argue that this board has an interest in Fairleigh as a part of the district, and if one says that one cannot have jurisdiction as a board over Fairleigh, then any house that occurs on Fairleigh would be out of your jurisdiction if it can't be viewed. Why? Where's your jurisdiction if Fairleigh as a private road is not within it?
I also have another question, which I don't want to be unfair to you, but you're one of the architects here who can help hopefully answer this question. But I've heard a number of people allude to or make a very explicit, even photographic comparison of this house to a city block. And I'm wondering, with your architectural experience, whether you believe that is either a fair or a valid comparison.
Well, I think that as a number, 200 feet is about the number of a standard street-to-street block in Manhattan. So numerically, it's accurate. Is a Manhattan block in any way, shape, or form similar to this house? No. But I think it was used by me and by others as a way of kind of keying in what that feels like, what 200 feet feels like. So, and I thought that the gentleman who rolled out the street and then had the white cutouts, I thought that was way more effective than anything I said, because I thought that it was a way of bringing together a dimension that everyone understood with buildings that everyone knows, and saying this is that big, that's that big. And I don't think that, you guys are very, very knowledgeable, but you see these things all the time. You know that 200 feet in Manhattan is very different than 200 feet off of Gin Lane. I think that there's I think it's just a way of scaling it. I think that it's, if you and I were, I don't know, I don't do sports, so I don't know if it was the length of a soccer field or, I don't know, the distance from first to third base running down. I don't know. If there was a way, I think it's just a common reference that people understand. I understand that it may carry a pejorative quality to it because, it's city versus country and whatever, but as a number, I think it's a fair number.
Just the length number?
Right.
It's usually what we see.
Oh, it's not, I don't think, I hope I didn't convey the sense that it was the same as a row of tenements on 8th Avenue. It's not. It's standing in isolation in a beautiful landscaped setting. No, but as a length, that's what 200 feet is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have to make a
He didn't ask you a question. He wasn't asked a question.
I have to make a remark about the right-of-way.
He wasn't asked a question.
You have jurisdiction over public right-of-ways or any other right-of-way. It's a bogus issue that it's a private road or a public road. It doesn't affect your jurisdiction. And when you talk about views, does it protect views? The design guidelines say that new construction should never tower over its adjacent neighbors. So it is relevant.
Tower, 63 feet, Michael Check,
Board
61
members,
Manger.
Madam Chairwoman, again, this is the point of the questions, if you're going to ask, or otherwise this will just go on and the gentlemen can't control themselves.
No kidding.
You have to do something to make sure we get the testimony that you're looking for.
I'm done with my questions, thank you.
Are you finished?
Yep.
All right,
Anybody else have questions or comments?
right now.
No, because the questions become statements, and statements end up becoming sources of deliberation. That's the issue. That's the problem.
Right.
I'm not interested in closing it, so someone else can.
It's up to the chair.
May I ask a very quick question?
Okay.
Okay, 2 minutes.
Okay.
State your name, please.
Gina Grieven, 375 Ox Pasture Road. My question is, it's a late night, and the back and forth is very confusing. We've had so much to hear and think about. And I make a suggestion, why can't we adjourn this for a date maybe a week from now? We come back, we hear all the discussions in the meantime. What?
It's a legality. We can't do that. We can only come back, no.
Well, we could adjourn it if we felt we...
Oh, we can adjourn it till the next meeting.
That's what she was asking. If you
That's what I meant. That's what I meant.
Not
Adjourn
in
for
a
the next,
week.
so that, well, whatever, 2 weeks or 3 weeks.
It's every 2 weeks.
Okay, Susan, whatever, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 10 days. Because there's so much that we've heard tonight that I'm totally confused. As a village resident and a taxpayer, I'd like to know, more detail, and I understand some of the details that we have heard tonight. That's all I'm saying. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
All right, board. I don't want to close the meeting, so I wouldn't possibly make a motion to do so. I would only make a motion.
Don't look at me, I'm not making a motion.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, there's only 3 other people left.
Given that we have the ability to reopen the hearing if we believe there's reason to, whether it's the Phil issue or other testimony we receive, we have that ability. I think we all understand what some of those issues might be. I certainly have an open mind on anything we might receive. I would like to make a motion at this point that we close this application for written submissions over the next 10 days, and then for further deliberation, which would then allow further deliberation at our next meeting on March 25th.
And written decision. Thereafter.
Okay.
That's fine. As long as we can still discuss, right?
Yeah. Can't we make that as a separate motion at the next meeting?
Well, you should close the record, and you have a certain time to make a decision at that point. So you would just put it over. You can certainly adjourn that if you're not ready to make the decision at that point.
Okay. So it's closed for written submissions and written decision.
10 days?
Written
So
submissions
what is
to be
10
received.
days from today?
Can you make it 10 business days because we got hung up
Well, let's
this
create a
past...
date certain.
Why do we get hung
and
up?
a time certain.
Because
We
it was
got
a
hung up this
holiday.
past day because there was a holiday in the middle. So I'd like to make it 10 business
it was-
days,
the
which is
building department was
effectively
closed.
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah, why
So
not?
what is the date?
The 11th.
The 11th.
I have jury duty.
Well, that's our meeting, right?
Nice meeting
That's
you.
our meeting.
No, I'll probably still be here, but
Can we make it the
Written
Friday
submissions.
before? Can we get the submissions the Friday before, at least, the 8th?
let's try. I feel like if it,
So the 8th.
Close of business on the 8th.
2 weeks.
so do you say that?
That's your
That's what you
motion.
feel.
The
Go ahead.
motion is to close for written submissions and written decision which will allow deliberation at our next meeting, but written submissions by at close of business Friday, March 8th.
How many weeks is that?
2.
Just under 2.
Second.
Aye.
Aye.
Nay.
Aye.
Thank you.